Under the marble bones of the Vatican hides a city of ghosts, forgotten popes, disappeared tombs, and temples dedicated to gods that the Church tried to erase. Before the throne of Peter, whispers existed. Before the saints, secrets existed. This is not only the origin of Christianity. It is the most disputed, encrypted, and unresolved terrain in human history. And tonight, we will unearth everything buried there. Welcome to the most unresolved ancient mysteries in the Vatican. Before we dive into the depths, do me a favor. Press the subscribe button if you like to uncover the darkest secrets of history. And tell me in the comments what part of the world you are watching from and what time it is right now. Because whether it's midnight in Manila or noon in New York, this story is about to take you underground. The exact location of the crucifixion and burial of St. Peter. Before the domes, before the altars, before Miguel Ángel put brush to plaster or Constantino placed stone upon stone, there was a hill, an irregular and steep slope on the western outskirts of Rome. A place outside the sacred limits of the city. The Pomerium, a place of execution, of refuge, of blood soaked in loam and silence thick as ash. That hill was called the Vatican. And according to ancient tradition, somewhere on that hill, a man named Simon Pedro, fisherman from Galilee, then apostle, and then fugitive, was crucified upside down by order of the Emperor Narration. His death was a spectacle, part of a state-sponsored terror campaign after the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64 AD. Narration blamed the Christians. Pedro, as one of their leaders, was the perfect target for the crowd. But here is the mystery. We don't know exactly where it happened, and we may never know. The place most related to his death is the Circus of Narration, a long and narrow chariot racetrack that once stretched through what is now the southern part of the Vatican City. An obelisk that once stood in the center of the circus now rises above Plaza de San Pedro, a silent and monolithic witness. But the ancient Roman circuses were enormous. The maps of its exact footprint vary. Some say that Pedro was executed along the spina, the central barrier of the racetrack. Others argue that he was killed just outside its limits. What we have are fragments. Tacitus tells us that Christians were nailed to crosses, dressed in animal skins, and set on fire as living torches in the gardens of Narration. The tradition of the Church fills the gaps by affirming that Pedro, out of humility, asked to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die in the same way as Christo. But tradition is not a GPS. Let's move forward a few decades. The followers of Pedro, secretive, persecuted, and determined, recovered his body, not from reverent hands, but probably under cover of darkness, evading Roman guards and rummaging among the corpses. The story goes that they buried him in a shallow tomb on the hill of the Vatican. No headstone, no sanctuary, just earth and memory. In the 2nd century, that memory had a marker, the tropio of gas, a kind of sanctuary, a trophy of martyrdom, mentioned in a preserved letter from a Roman presbyter named Gas. He described it as a monument over the tomb of Pedro, which was still visited by Christians 100 years after the apostle's death. It was not a basilica. It wasn't even a chapel. It was a rudimentary brick structure hidden among the tombs of a Roman necropolis. Something between a boast and a declaration, a whisper made of stone. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantino converted to Christianity and ordered the construction of a huge basilica in this place. Its builders razed part of the necropolis and erected a church directly over what they believed to be the tomb of Pedro. To center the altar, they had to build a huge platform on the uneven terrain of the hill. The effort was unprecedented. It was a feat of engineering, ideology, and imperial faith. But Constantino's architects did not leave detailed notes. And the exact orientation of that original sanctuary was buried under centuries of reconstructions. Then came the years 1090 and 139. During renovations under the Basilica de San Pedro, workers came across ancient funerary inscriptions that had not been touched since the beginning of the Roman period. Excavations began carefully under the watchful eye of the Vatican. During the following decade, archaeologists discovered a necropolis, pagan tombs, Christian burials, and elaborate mausoleums aligned on a narrow street buried under centuries of ecclesiastical architecture. And under the high altar, they located a niche. Behind it, a cavity in the so-called red wall, a structure once believed to be part of the gastropion. Inside the niche was a marble-lined deposit, and inside it, human bones. Subsequent tests revealed that the bones belonged to a man between 60 and 70 years old, matching the age attributed to Pedro at the time of his death. However, the skull was not found, believed to rest in a reliquary in the Basilica of San Juan de Latran. Even so, Pope Paul VI declared in 1968 that the bones found under the altar were, in all probability, those of St. Peter. But not everyone agrees. Skeptics point to the lack of direct evidence linking the bones to Peter. There was no inscription, no DNA, no carbon dating that could confirm the apostolic lineage, only circumstantial evidence and faith. Others question the alignment of the modern altar with the ancient shrine. Was the Basilica of Constantine really centered over the tomb of Pedro, or was it slightly off-center? Some archaeologists argue that the true tomb is to the left of the current altar, not directly below it. Others suggest that the remains may have been moved during the early centuries of persecution or reconstruction. And then there is the subject of the circus. If Pedro was killed in the circus of Narration, where did the execution take place in relation to the tomb? Was his body carried uphill through the necropolis, passing pagan mausoleums? Was that place chosen because it was hidden or sacred, or simply because it was the closest place where his followers could bury him without capture? We do not know, and the Vatican is not carrying out further excavations. In fact, much of the necropolis remains unexcavated, restricted, and walled off, not for sinister reasons, but for conservation purposes. These are fragile tombs, ancient frescoes, and crumbling inscriptions. Disturbing, it could destroy what little evidence remains, leaving us with a paradox. The Catholic Church is literally built on the foundations of Pedro's martyrdom. The Pope is called the successor of Pedro, and yet the exact place where Pedro died remains unknown. The coordinates of the beginning are blurred. The cornerstone may not be where we think it is, and maybe that's the point. Pedro was not a safe man. He denied Christ 3 times. He fled from danger. He doubted, stumbled, and returned. His journey was chaotic, human, plagued with contradictions, just like the history of his tomb. In the end, perhaps the power of the place does not lie in knowing exactly where the bones lie. It lies in the millions of feet that cross the square every year, searching, kneeling, believing, or questioning. Everything counts. But if the place of Pedro's crucifixion remains a question mark buried under centuries of myths and marble, what about the woman he left behind? Because Pedro was not alone when he followed Christ. He had a wife. And her story, the story of the companion of the first pope, unnamed, unrecorded, unknown, has been erased by time with even more precision. Let's talk about her. The identity of St. Peter's wife and family. Before being St. Peter, before the miracles, the martyrdom, and the statue in the square, he was just Simon, a fisherman, a husband, possibly a father, a man with calloused hands who lived in a house by the Sea of Galilee. The scriptures give us a tempting detail. In the Gospel of Mark 1 verse 30, it says, Simon's mother-in-law was sick with a fever. Jesus heals her, and she gets up and begins to serve them. There it is, a flash, a single flash of domestic life. If Pedro had a mother-in-law, then he had a wife. That is how mothers-in-law operate. But beyond that single phrase, she disappears. Her name is never mentioned, her voice never heard, her destiny never recorded. It is as if she had been allowed a brief moment, then quickly absorbed into the background of a story dominated by men. And yet, she was there, somewhere behind the scenes of those gospel stories. Pedro's wife cooked, endured persecution, and probably lived in fear, since her husband had left everything to follow an apocalyptic preacher with no money, no status, and many enemies. Some early Christian traditions claim she traveled with Pedro, witnessed miracles, and suffered alongside him. Origins, a 3rd-century theologian, even wrote that Pedro's wife was martyred before his eyes in Roma. According to his account, Pedro saw his wife being taken to execution and shouted, "Remember the Lord." It is a shocking, disturbing, tender, and completely devoid of contemporary evidence image. Even so, the account of Origen's was picked up by other writers, including Clementi de Alexandria. It evolved. In some versions, Pedro and his wife were crucified together, a tragic Christian couple martyred as one. In others, she dies first, paving the way for Pedro's sacrifice. But we have no bones, no sanctuaries, no epistles written by her, no records of children, just the hint of a woman and the void her absence leaves. So what happened to her? A possibility erased on purpose. The early church, especially after the 2nd century, began to lean towards celibacy as a spiritual ideal. Asceticism was fashionable. Sexual abstinence, especially among the clergy, was considered a sign of divine focus. That made Pedro's marital status inconvenient. After all, he was the rock upon which the church had been built. And yet, if he had a wife and possibly children, that complicated the narrative of apostolic purity that later church leaders wanted to promote. So her memory was quietly erased. No scandals, no repression, just omission by attrition. Over time, her name faded from oral tradition. Her story was never written down. Over time, she became a theological footnote, an implication, not a person. And yet, she could be more relevant than ever. Let's imagine the first pope, not a celibate cardinal with red shoes, but a married man with a family, responsibilities, and in-laws. A man who had to negotiate his faith not only with emperors and mobs, but also with the dinner table, sick relatives, and the silent discussions of married life. Her presence reframes the figure of Pedro. It reminds us that he was human, that holiness did not erase his past, that the foundations of the church were laid not only by martyrs and mystics, but by families, by people who had to leave behind their homes, their livelihoods, and their loved ones. And she was not alone. Many of the apostles were married. Pablo often mentions it in his letters with a touch of jealousy or sarcasm. In 1 Corinthians 9 verse 5 he writes, "Do we not have the right to take with us a believing wife, like the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord in Fuss?" Fuss is Pedro. The early Christian movement was not built in monasteries. It was built in homes, in kitchens on the road, with wives, husbands, children, and in-laws following itinerant preachers from town to town, hiding from the Roman authorities, gathering food and faith. But Pedro's wife remains anonymous. We don't even know what language she spoke. Probably Aramaic. We do not know what she was like, if she supported Pedro's decision to leave fishing, if she was bothered by the long absences, if she ever doubted the mission. In modern terms, she would be considered a founding mother of the church, one of the first, a matriarch of a global institution. But history did not see it that way. She was not canonized. She has no holiday, no basilica, not even a name engraved in stone. And there lies a true mystery. How many key figures, especially women, have been lost in the white noise of ancient history? How many mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters built the early church from the margins, only to be erased by time, theology, or indifference? Peter's wife represents all of them. The anonymous women who cared for the sick, fed the apostles, sheltered fugitives, and faced Roman persecution, not as martyrs, but as collateral damage. They died without relics, sanctity, or even a whisper. Today, scholars try to reconstruct fragments of their lives. Archaeological excavations in Galilee have uncovered first-century houses believed to have belonged to early Christian families. Some inscriptions point to female patrons, possibly even leaders of domestic churches, but Peter's wife remains missing. Not forgotten, just missing. And perhaps that is why this mystery remains important. Because in a religious tradition obsessed with names, Mateo, Marcos, Lucas, Juan, Pedro, Pablo, there is power in remembering the anonymous, the shadows behind the saints, the women in the background, whose silence was not consent, but circumstance. In the end, Peter's wife could be the church's first ghost, haunting the footnotes, floating between verses. A presence that is felt but never mentioned, a shapeless foundation. And perhaps, when Peter faced his final hour, crucified upside down in the blood-soaked sand of the circuses of Narration, his thoughts did not turn only to heaven, to Christ, or to his fellow apostles. Perhaps, just perhaps, he thought of her, and perhaps she was already waiting for him. But Peter's story, like the church itself, was not born in isolation. It grew in soil soaked with sacrifice and secrecy. And beyond the memory of his wife, a deeper mystery arises that moves between legend and encounter, between vision and flight. Because before dying, Peter tried to flee. And on that road, he met someone impossible. Let's go there. If you stick with us, you are one of those who inquire beyond. And I respect that. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what is still to be discovered. And since you're here, leave a comment. From where are you following us? And what time is it now? Let's see who is tracking the catacombs of the Vatican. At 3 a.m. the Quo Vadis Roma meeting was on fire. Not literally this time, but figuratively, spiritually, a city swollen with paranoia, boiling under the weight of power and rumors. The reign of Narration was in full swing, decadent, theatrical, and blood-soaked. And under that strange Roman sun, a movement spread like silent fire through the alleys and catacombs. A movement of the poor, the slaves, the marginalized. A movement that spoke of resurrection, of grace, of a kingdom not of this world. And that made it dangerous. The Christians were no longer a strange sect of Judaism. They were becoming a problem. And Peter, the apostle who once walked on water and has since stumbled at every step, now found himself at the center of that storm. In Roma, hidden but not enough, the persecution of Christians had begun in earnest. Narration, anxious to divert blame for the great fire of the year 64 AC, needed scapegoats, and Peter, preacher, leader, and symbol, was first on the list. So he did what many others did in the face of state-sanctioned death. He fled. It tells the story that Pedro, urged by other Christians, fled the city along the old Roman road, lined with tombs and silence, with dust on his feet and fear in his bones. And then, somewhere along that road, something happened. A figure appeared, a man walking toward the city in the opposite direction. Pedro stopped him. Quo vadis, Domini, Lord, and the man, Christ himself, replied, "I'm going to Rome to be crucified again." That phrase stopped time. What follows is legend, but it is a legend engraved in marble, in literature, in the very identity of the Christian martyr. Upon hearing the words of Christ, Pedro turned around. He returned to Rome to die. Let's pause because this moment, the encounter with Quo Vadis, is one of those strange nodes in history where myth, faith, and psychology collide. It is cinematographic, intimate, interwoven with guilt and redemption. But was it real? The first written version of this story appears in the apocryphal Acts of Pedro, a 2nd century text considered non-canonical by most Christian traditions. It is dramatic, detailed, and openly miraculous. The story includes not only the encounter with Quo Vadis, but also the inverted crucifixion of Pedro and a long speech as he dies. But apocryphal does not mean worthless. It means that the early church did not include it in the official canon, often because the text was too elaborate, too symbolic, or too contradictory. But these works continued to be read, copied, and whispered in domestic churches illuminated by oil lamps and fear. The story of Quo Vadis became more than just a story. It became a template, a model of repentance. Pedro, let us remember, had failed before. He denied Christ 3 times on the night of the crucifixion. He wept bitterly, but returned, and here again he is called back. It is cyclical, a man who always fails forward, failing towards glory. But let's look at the geography. The road still exists. You can travel it. Outside the ancient walls of Rome, near the church of Quo Vadis, there is a stone slab with 2 footprints. Ancient tradition claims that they are from Christ, miraculously imprinted on the rock during that encounter. They are probably much later inventions, but they speak of something deeper, not of the truth, but of the resonance. Why does this story endure? Why does it matter that Pedro turned around? Because it humanizes holiness. It strips the apostle of his mythical invincibility. He is not a stoic saint of marble. He is a man terrified of death, tormented by guilt, who needs one last push from the divine to do the right thing. And he does it. He returns not for glory, nor for revenge, but for fidelity. However, there is another point of view. Some scholars argue that the Quo Vadis moment is allegorical, that was never intended to be a literal event, but a dramatization of Pedro's internal conflict, a moral fable inserted into the apostolic narrative to reinforce Christian ideals of courage and sacrifice. That the appearance of Christ was not a physical encounter, but a vision, a hallucination born of guilt and spiritual pressure. Or perhaps it was propaganda, a literary tool used by early Christian leaders to reinforce the idea that martyrdom was not only noble but necessary, that turning towards death instead of fleeing was the pinnacle of faith. In this reading, Pedro's moment on the road becomes a kind of spiritual recruitment, a return to the fire because Christ did. But there is still mystery here because, despite its apocryphal origin, the story stuck. It earned a place in the Christian consciousness. It became a common element in sermons, in paintings, and in pilgrimages. A small church was built on the spot where it supposedly happened. The pilgrims continued to visit and ask the question. Quote is, "Where are you going?" And perhaps that's why the story endures, because the question isn't only for Pedro. It is for everyone. Where are you going? Away from suffering, toward comfort? Are you turning your back on something because it's too difficult, too dangerous, or too much? The power of the Quo Vadis moment resides in its happening during movement. Pedro isn't in a temple. He is not praying. He is walking. He is fleeing. And it is in that vulnerable and chaotic human moment that the divine intervenes. It is not only theology. It is the structure of the story. Archetype, transformation. And perhaps Pedro never had the vision. Perhaps he simply changed his mind. Perhaps the weight of leaving his flock behind, the guilt for the abandonment, the knowledge of what had already happened in Jerusalem. Perhaps all that made him turn back. But the early church wanted more. They wanted a vision, a ghost, a Christ who would retrace the path. So they gave us one. And we believed, even today, the Church of Dominatus remains a silent witness. Small, quiet, hidden among Roman cypresses and dust. Inside is a copy of the stone with the supposed footprints. On the wall, the Latin words quoties damen. The question resonates through centuries. It is not a historical certainty. It is not archaeological proof. It is something more, something stranger, a truth deeper than the facts. Because the story isn't only about where Pedro is going. It is about why. And that why takes us directly to the heart of Rome, to the blood and bones of its first Christian community. A hidden world buried under centuries of basilicas and bureaucracies. A secret church of outcasts and whisperers, of rituals and darkness, of symbols engraved on walls and tombs. Because after Pedro repented, after embracing death, others followed him. And they did not build monuments. They built catacombs. The nature of the first Christian community on the Vatican Hill. To understand the first Christian community on the Vatican Hill, forget everything you know about churches. There were no organs, no towering domes, no benches, no incense, or stained glass windows. There were no priests with gold investments, nor songs in Latin resonating among the stones. There was not even a church. There were simple, borrowed, semi-lit rooms, spaces behind taverns, above fish markets under the floor of homes. In the shadow of the imperial palaces, the Christians met in silence, vigilant, always attentive to the steps. They were not trying to build a kingdom. They were trying to survive. And among the tombs of the Vatican Hill, they began to take root. Let's go back. Let's rewind it. The Vatican Hill in the first century was not sacred. It was not even officially Roman. The Vatican was outside the religious limits of the city, the Pomerium. It was on the other side of the wall, a place for gardens, cemeteries, and occasional chariot races. The Circus of Nero stood at its southern end. To the north, cemeteries, pagan tombs, mausoleums of the Roman elite. In other words, it was a dead zone. And that made it perfect because Christians needed places where they would not be seen. Their meetings were technically illegal under Roman law. They were not always aggressively persecuted, but they were always suspect. They were accused of cannibalism. They ate the body and blood of Christ. Incest. They called themselves brothers and sisters, and atheism. They refused to worship the Roman gods in a world built on civic religion, which made them dangerous. So they met in secret, and, over time, the area around the Vatican Hill, despite its dark reputation, became one of their havens. But what was that early community like? To begin with, small, very small. We're not talking about thousands of followers. Think of dozens, a few dozen, maybe more during important holidays. The first Christian meetings were held in homes. The Greek term oikos ekklesia, domestic church, describes both the place and the community. These were not religious structures built expressly for that purpose. They were modified houses, halls where bread was broken, wine was served, and scriptures were shared, still oral and incomplete. Rome itself was a powder keg of poverty and class tensions. The first Christian converts were often women, slaves, freedmen, and foreigners, the marginalized of society. The people who had the least to lose and the most to gain from a faith that promised eternal life, radical equality, and divine justice. The Vatican Hill, with its mixture of elite tombs and humbler burials, became a refuge and place of resonance. But there is more. Archaeological excavations under the modern Vatican have discovered a necropolis and an ancient city of the dead. These tombs were built along a narrow street, the Via Cornelia, which once snaked along the hillside. Some of the mausoleums are decorated with colorful frescoes and pagan inscriptions. Others are humble, little more than stone boxes with engraved names. And within this necropolis, something strange emerges. Christian symbols, faint, coded in their beginnings. The fish, the anchor, the chiro. They were not decorations. They were identifiers, signals for the faithful, symbols that meant you were not alone, symbols that whispered, "We are here." The first Christians of the Vatican Hill did not build temples. They borrowed the architecture of death. They carved their faith into the walls of the tombs. And they came here for a reason. The tomb of Peter. Although the exact location of his crucifixion is debated, there is no doubt that his burial, humble, superficial, and anonymous, took place somewhere in this necropolis. And for the early church, that tomb became a magnet, a place of remembrance. It was not exactly a place of worship, but rather a place to remember and strengthen a fragile movement in the martyrdom of its leader. They did not build a shrine. They could not. So they gathered nearby. Around him, whispered prayers, perhaps touched the wall. Perhaps it was truly the Tropio of Guise. Not a monument, but a meeting point, a rough marker that said, "Here lies the rock." But what happened at those meetings? Forget choirs and sermons. Think of confessions, testimonies, psalms sung from memory, prayers passed as contraband. They read letters from Paul, fragments of the gospel that they possessed. Not everyone could read. So the stories were told, then retold, then reshaped in the light of the fire and with time, and they ate. The agape feast, bread and wine shared in memory. Not only a ritual, but a lifeline. In a city where many were starving, the Christian table was an act of resistance, a declaration that the last would be first and the hungry would be fed, but always with fear. Roman officials were not fools. They had spies, informants, neighbors who asked many questions. That is why the catacombs became crucial not only for burial, but also worship. They were safe, dark hidden. Entire chapels were excavated below ground. The inscriptions ask for prayer. The symbols guide the faithful. The tombs of saints and martyrs became altars. And yet on the Vatican Hill, most catacombs were pagan, which makes the presence of the first Christians here even more fascinating. Because instead of hiding underground, Some chose to live and worship among the dead in plain sight. On the margins of a Roman necropolis, they left signs of new life. But we have no names. Or rather, we have names without faces. Inscriptions like Petrus, Aquila, Phoebe. Were they followers, martyrs, or leaders? We do not know. The records are incomplete. Dust, scratches, and broken marble. Enough to suggest, but never to confirm. Some scholars believe that the first Christians created mental, symbolic, and literal maps from these tombs, a network of sacred places united by memory and danger. The domestic churches met in shifts. Messages were passed from hand to hand. Baptisms were celebrated in wells, fountains, and even sewers. Nothing was permanent. Everything was fragile, and yet it endured. That is the true miracle. Not the resurrection, but resistance. The ability of this small, persecuted community to survive in the bowels of the empire. To meet in secret, sing in the dark, write letters and bury their dead, and whisper the name of Pedro as password. Today, the Vatican Hill is a fortress, gold, marble ceremony. But 2,000 years ago, it was much simpler. A place where the marginalized gathered among tombs, where memory was all they had, where the smell of death was constant. But hope still flickered, because that glimmer was enough. And in that glimmer, another mystery takes a deeper, ancient shape still buried. Because a few meters from where Pedro could have been buried, another Roman structure cast its long shadow, a circus of death, a place where blood was sport and suffering was spectacle. The circus of Narration. And what lies beneath it may still await discovery. The true extent of the circus of Narration. The circus of Narration is not just a place. Not anymore. Nowadays, it is a memory embodied in myth paved by centuries of imperial ambition and sacred devotion. But in its day, it was the loudest whisper of Roma, a place of blood and applause, where the roar of the crowd masked the screams of the dying, a place where the empire fed on flesh, and buried somewhere under the southern edge of the Vaticano, under cobblestones, chapels, and saints, the bones still lie. Let's go back. The Circus of Narration was not the great stadium of the Coliseo. Not yet. This was earlier and far more personal. It was built in the mid-1st century, probably by the Emperor Caligula, and later expanded or converted by his successor Narration. The exact year of construction remains unclear. What we know is that in the year 64 A.D.C., after the Great Fire of Roma, it was ready to serve as stage for imperial revenge. Narration needed a scapegoat. The fire had consumed much of the city. Rumors spread that the emperor himself had caused it, so he blamed the Christians, and the Circus of Narration became his Golgotha. Chariot races during the day, executions at night. The Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote decades later, describes the scene with chilling precision. Christians were covered with animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. Others were soaked in tar and set on fire to light up the night. And all this, according to Tacitus, was organized as part of a grotesque party in the garden of the Vaticano Hill, offered by the emperor himself. It was not justice. It was theater. But what was this place really like? This is where the mystery deepens. Unlike the Coliseo or the Circo Maximo, the Circus of Narration left almost no architectural trace. What little we know comes from later medieval descriptions, scattered fragments of marble, and a few archaeological excavations allowed under the strict supervision of the Vaticano. The traditional model suggests a long rectangular arena typical of Roman circuses, about 300 m long and possibly 100 m wide. A central barrier, the spina, would have run the entire length of the track, decorated with statues, obelisks, and victory markers. The famous obelisk of the Vaticano, the one that stands proudly today in San Pedro Square, was once the centerpiece of that spina. It is the only element of the Circus of Nero that is still in its original vertical orientation. Think about it. The obelisk that tourists photograph and around which pilgrims pray in a circle once stood in the center of a field of death. But beyond the obelisk, the structure fades into conjecture. There are no complete plans or definitive excavations. Why? Because the area was later occupied by the Basilica of Constantino in the 4th century and then by the Renaissance reconstruction. The Vaticano was built on the circus as a second skin. Some remains exist under the sacred ground of the Basilica of San Pedro. A few brick walls may belong to the southern grandstand of the circus. Fragments of curved foundations suggest a turning post, but the actual scale and exact footprint are unknown. And that is no coincidence. For almost 2,000 years, the Vatican has been a palimpsest city superimposed, rewritten, and reactivated. If one excavates too much, one runs the risk of unraveling not only history, but also sanctity. You could find not only tombs, but something worse, questions. Even so, the clues persist. Some old maps and Renaissance plans point to a structure longer than traditionally believed. Some scholars argue that the circus extended further west, under the current Vatican gardens. Others suggest a north-south orientation, aligned with certain necropolis walls. And then there is the problem of the bodies. If Pedro was crucified in the circus, as tradition holds, where was the execution place? Near the obelisk along the spina? Was it a separate area? Were the corpses left exposed? Were they buried nearby or thrown away like garbage? We do not know. And nevertheless, we know because the hill absorbed it. The blood, the bones, the terror, everything. The land under the basilica is not only sacred, it is saturated. And here comes the chilling thing. There may be more down there. More foundations, more tombs, more evidence of the circus's true extent. The Vatican necropolis excavations of the 1940s only explored a narrow corridor under the basilica. Much of the southern area, where the circus probably extended, remains intact, closed by Vatican protocols and preserved in silence. Why? In part to protect it. The structures are old and fragile. Any large-scale excavation runs the risk of collapsing, but also, let's be honest, because of what could be found. Imagine discovering a mass grave of martyrs. Imagine finding execution posts, blood channels, or remains of a rudimentary amphitheater. It would electrify the faithful and complicate the narrative. It would turn the Basilica of San Pedro not only into a place of worship, but a crime scene. And some crimes history prefers to canonize, not exhume. But silence only fuels the mystery. Every time a renovation is announced in the Vatican, scholars hold their breath. Each new floor panel that is removed could reveal another portion of the 1st century. A new wall, a lost corridor, a fragment of Nero's nightmare playground. And always under everything, that obelisk rises. It has no inscriptions, no hieroglyphs, just a 25-meter high red granite finger pointing to the sky. It was brought from Egypt by Caligula and witnessed the death of saints. Then it saw how the church grew around him, layer by layer, prayer by prayer. It has seen everything, but says nothing. So we assume, we draw maps, we make models, we argue about lines on a page and whispers in stone. We imagine what Nero saw when he sat on the observation platform. The laughter, the boos, the dying. We imagine Pedro, perhaps tied and bleeding, forced to look at the obelisk before they nailed him upside down. And we imagine what is still hidden under the gardens, the chapels, the marble floors. Because if the circus was bigger than we thought, if its true scale has been underestimated, then the number of Christians executed there could be greater. The most buried stories, the oldest crimes. It's not just about architecture. It's about the truth. And the truth, like ancient blood, has a habit of seeping upwards. Fine cracks, stained foundations, persist. But while the Vatican remains standing, the full outline of Nero's circus will remain blurred, half remembered, half denied. A ghost arena beneath the most famous church in the world. And yet, if the structure is hard to find, what about its remains? Its artifacts, the things left behind when the circus fell silent. What happened to objects used in those executions? The ropes, the nails, the sandals of the condemned, the blood-stained tools of the dark spectacle of Rome. Have they been lost to time or simply misplaced? Because the mystery of Nero's circus does not end with the architecture. It leads directly to its relics. The disappearance of the first Christian artifacts from Nero's circus. What does a martyr leave behind? Not the glory that follows. Not holiness, which is a posthumous invention. Not even the stories, which take time to ferment and become scripture. No, what martyr leaves behind above all else are things. Tangible things. Broken chains, blood-soaked robes, splintered crosses, objects that once witnessed agony. And yet, from the bloodbath that was Nero's circus, from the spectacle of horror that claimed the life of Peter and many others, we have no confirmed relics, no nails, no fragments of wood, no shackles, no weapons, no clothing, nothing. Where are they? Where are the physical remains of Rome's first Christian purge? Because if the stories are true, if dozens, perhaps hundreds of Christians were executed in that arena, there must have been artifacts, tools of death and traces of the dead, the things that did not disappear with the soul. Let's explore some possibilities. First, destruction. The most obvious answer is simplest. The artifacts are destroyed, they rotted, they rusted, consumed by centuries. Iron nails corrode. Wood disintegrates. Cloth turns to dust. Time is the most effective eraser of all evidence. And Roman soil is a relentless archivist. But even so, that does not explain the total absence, because the early church was obsessed with any relics. In the century after the death of Peter, Christians collected the bones of martyrs, kept them in ossuaries, prayed over them, and built altars over their remains. The nails, hair, teeth, and even dust from their tombs became sacred objects. The body was not only sacred, but strategic. Possessing a relic of a martyr gave a community legitimacy, protection, and spiritual influence. So, if the circus was the place of Peter's crucifixion, if it was the place of execution of dozens of early Christians, why are there no relics from that place? Why is there no reliquary with wood from the cross of Mount Vatican, an iron nail from Nero's circus, or a fragment of the mantle of an unknown martyr? Surely someone must have saved something. This leads us to the second possibility, concealment. Perhaps the relics were stolen and hidden by the first faithful, hidden in house churches, buried under floors, or passed from hand to hand. Perhaps the women who recovered Peter's body also took some bloody cloth. Perhaps a convert bribed a guard to get a piece of cross. Perhaps a slave swept the floor and kept what Romans threw away. This theory fits the clandestine culture of early Christianity. These were people used to acting in shadows. The act of preserving relics would not have been institutionalized yet. It would have been desperate, personal, and improvised. But if those objects were kept, where did they end up at? They do not appear in known inventories of relics from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, neither in Rome, nor Constantinople, nor in the scattered reliquaries of medieval Europe, at least not under those names, unless, of course, they were renamed, reframed, or absorbed into other traditions. There is a tempting theory among some relic historians, a small and controversial niche within ecclesiastical archaeology, which holds that some of the most precious relics of later Christendom may have originated in the circus of Nero, though no one knew. Or if they knew, they did not say. Imagine a piece of wood labeled as part of Christ's cross that actually came from the crucifixion of Peter, a nail venerated in Antioch, said to be Roman from the 1st century, but with no clear provenance. A fragment of tunic venerated in Gaul, said to belong to a local martyr, but chemically identical to fabrics found in 1st century Rome. Without modern forensic science, these objects became what believers needed them as. The power of a relic was in its story, not its certificate of authenticity. But what if the stories were false? What if the Narration relics were scattered throughout Christianity, hidden in plain sight under wrong names? It's not just speculation. There are hundreds of alleged sovereign relics of the true cross scattered around the world. So many that the 16th century humanist Erasmus joked that there were enough to build Noah's Arkansas. Some were false, of course, but others were simply misfiled. Think of the chaos that reigned within the early Christian records. There was no central authority, no digital archives, no standardized labeling, just faith, fire, and fear. A bishop of Carthage learns that Rome is being purged. He receives a small package from a contact there. A bone, a splinter of wood, a strip of linen. He hides it, protects it, gives it the name of a martyr he knows, not suspecting it comes from the heart of Rome. And then, centuries later, it is consecrated. That's how relics get passed down, not as museum pieces, but as whispers. But perhaps the relics of the circus of Nero did not disappear or scatter. Maybe they were never recovered. That is the third possibility, suppression. What if the early church didn't want these objects to survive? What if the vision of the circus was considered too profane, too defiled? What if the relics of Peter's execution were not venerated, but avoided because martyrdom was sacred? Yes, but the instruments of death, the cross that killed the apostle, the nails, the blood-soaked sand, perhaps were not considered relics. Perhaps they were trauma. The psychology of early Christian memory is complex. Not all visions of pain became visions of pilgrimage. Often, the focus was on the resurrection, not the method of execution. Peter was not remembered for how he died, but for why. His cross may have been burned, buried, or deliberately abandoned to rot. There is precedent for this. For centuries, Christians avoided the exact site of Golgotha. It was not until Constantine's mother, Helena, began her relic-hunting tour of the Holy Land in the 4th century that the Church began to institutionalize the places of suffering. Before that, veneration was more symbolic than spatial. So perhaps the artifacts of the circus of Nero were never collected. Perhaps they were feared. Perhaps the memory was too painful. Or maybe they were buried. That is the fourth and most tempting theory. That in some place under the Vatican, beneath layers of marble, crypts, chapels, and centuries, the lost artifacts of the first Christian executions of Rome, without labeling, without honoring, simply buried, thrown to common graves, burned in holes, covered in lime and dust. Imagine what still lies under the sacred ground, under the gardens in the south quadrant of the ancient necropolis, where archaeologists have not been able to excavate. Imagine a sealed underground room from the 2nd century, forgotten. Inside, iron nails, burned woods, fragments of bones with tool marks, a ring, a pendant, a piece of parchment, a fish symbol carved by hand on the wall. Without names, without context, only silence. The Vatican protects its soil with good reason. It is not about secrecy. It is about preservation. But each closed chamber, each blocked hallway, each unexcavated layer whispers the same question. What's still down there? Because the early Christian artifacts of the circus of Nero might not be lost. They could be waiting. And if they are, they're not only pieces of history. They're time bombs. Because each recovered object would demand rewriting everything that we know about the origin of the Church. A new relic unburned by legend, uncorrupted by centuries of embellishment, pure, raw, Roman. And if those relics are ever found, they will pose new mysteries, like the one that has always lurked in the shadow of Peter. Because, although the Church affirms that his remains were found, there is another apostle who also died in Rome, and nobody really knows where his bones are. The destiny of the remains of St. Paul. It begins, like so many things in Christian Rome, with a sword. Not a cross, nor a crown of thorns, but the sword of a Roman executioner. Fast, brutal, effective. Unlike Peter, Paul was a Roman citizen. That meant that he could not be crucified legally. Crucifixion was for slaves and traitors. Paul had a cleaner death, beheaded somewhere outside the city, on a road known by pilgrims and seekers of mysteries as the Via Ostiense. And from that moment, from that descending blow of Roman steel, another mystery was born. What happened to his body? We are told that the execution took place around the year 64 to 67 A.D.C., probably during the same persecution of Nero that claimed the life of Peter. The place is traditionally identified as Aquae Salvii, the site of the Abbey of the Three Fountains, where, according to legend, the severed head of Paul bounced 3 times, producing 3 miraculous springs. It is a dramatic, symbolic story, the type of miracle that grows throughout the centuries like ivy on stone. But miracles are not maps, and springs do not confirm a tomb. The early Christian tradition insists that Paul was buried not far from the place where he was executed, outside the limits of the city, next to the road that leads to the port city of Ostia. With time, That tomb became the heart of another great basilica, the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, San Paolo fuori le mura, second only to St. Peter in size and holiness. But here's the problem. The historical trail goes cold. Unlike Peter, whose burial place was venerated from the beginning and continuously, that had the tropion, the necropolis, the architectural crumbs, the tomb of Paul is more silent, more elusive, less concrete. The first mention of his tomb comes from a Christian writer of the 2nd century, Caius, the same presbyter who described this sanctuary of Peter. Caius wrote about 2 monuments in Rome, one dedicated to Peter on the Vatican Hill and another to Paul on the Via Ostiense. He called them tropotes. It is a potent word, but trophies of what? Victories, tombs, or sanctuaries. We do not know how these trophies were. Caius never described them. Were they simple markers, inscriptions on marble, small chapels? And more importantly, were they real tombs or simply symbolic memorials? Let's advance quickly to Constantino. In the 4th century, just when Constantino commissioned the basilica on the supposed tomb of Pedro, he also built a church on the supposed burial place of Pablo. It was not so big and it was not so complex. There was no necropolis or circus, but it was still important. The location was chosen based on the tradition, the oral history, and any proof that the Christian community preserved, and they built it with confidence. A basilica of stone and solemnity, flanked by cemeteries and marked with altars. With time, the place grew architecturally and theologically, becoming a pillar of Christendom. And, nevertheless, the archaeology has always been murkier. The excavations carried out in the 19th and XX centuries revealed a sarcophagus of white marble under the altar, like the Roman burials of the 4th century. It is in a crypt, visible through a glass panel installed in 2006. On the stone are engraved the Latin words Paulo Apostle Mart, referring to Pablo, apostle and martyr. That inscription stirred enthusiasm. Was that the tomb? The real tomb? The final resting place of the apostle to the Gentiles? Perhaps. But what's inside? For centuries, nobody had opened it. The Vatican resisted. It was sacred ground. They cited historical integrity. Then, in 2002, Pope Juan Pablo II discreetly approved a limited investigation. A team of Vatican archaeologists examined the sarcophagus using non-invasive methods. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI announced that a small hole had been drilled to allow introducing a probe to recover fragments of bones, a purple cloth with gold threads, and grains of red incense. After being analyzed, the bones belonged to a man between 60 and 70 years old, which coincided with Pablo's age when he died. That was the headline, Bones of San Pablo Found. But not everyone agreed. The samples were tiny. The proofs were limited. There was no carbon dating, DNA, or chain of provenance going back to the I century. The Vatican never declared that the bones were definitively Pablo's. Instead, they said, there is solid evidence that supports the tradition, which is a very Vatican way of saying, we are almost sure, but not completely. And thus, the mystery deepens. Because even if that sarcophagus contains Pablo's bones, it may not be his only burial. There are rumors, strange stories suggesting that Pablo's remains were moved, disassembled, and scattered. According to a medieval tradition, the remains of Pedro and Pablo were exhumed temporarily during the Valerian persecution in the middle of the 3rd century and hidden in the catacombs along the Road of Ion to protect them from the profanation. Later, they were supposedly returned to their original places. But stories like that are hard to verify. The catacombs are vast, dark, and chaotic. Thousands of tombs, many anonymous, and even the bones of martyrs were often moved, repackaged, and redistributed as relics. Some believe that parts of Pablo could have been moved to other churches. It is said, for example, that his head rests in a reliquary in the Basilica of San Juan Lawn together with Pedro's skull. 2 skulls, 2 apostles, 1 church. Are they authentic? It is hard to say. The authentication of relics in the Middle Ages was more art than science. The claims often surpassed the proofs. Theologians wrote treatises defending rival bones. The churches competed for prestige, and the relics were currency of exchange. Even so, something remains in San Pablo for Lemura. Maybe it's Pablo. Maybe it is symbolic. Maybe that is the crux of it. Because Pablo's true legacy is not in his bones, nor in his words. 13 letters preserved within the New Testament. Doctrinal, emotional, erratic, challenging. Pablo the theologian, prisoner, the voice that turned a small Jewish sect into a world religion. And, nevertheless, his physical trace, the man, the martyr, the corpse, remains elusive. There are no verified personal effects, no sandals, tunics, writing tablets, authenticated chains from his imprisonment, only letters and legends, and a marble slab under an altar, silent as stone. So why does that matter? Because Pedro and Pablo are the two pillars of Roman Christianity. Pedro, the rock. Pablo, the voice. Pedro gave the church structure. Pablo gave it fire. And, nevertheless, only one of them has a confirmed tomb, a visible sanctuary, a clear architectural lineage. The other is unknown, a shadow buried within tradition, a name carved on an altar, but not entirely linked to the bones beneath it. And perhaps that ambiguity is appropriate, because Pablo never felt comfortable staying in one place. He was a traveler, missionary, a man always on the move, crossing roads, cities, ideas. Perhaps even in death, he refused to be immobilized. Even so, the mystery still persists. Because if the church affirms with certainty what it says about Pedro, why does it settle for a probably regarding Pablo? What if the sarcophagus is truly empty? What if the bones were moved, then lost? What if some relic in a forgotten monastery labeled simply as Martyr of Roma contains the true remains? What if the Vatican knows more than they say? But as we reflect on the bones of Pablo, another darker question lurks beneath the surface. Because long before the basilicas were built, before the obelisks were reused, before Roma became holy, it was a city of fire and fear. And in the depths of the Vatican, in corridors closed to the public, another silence awaits us. It is not a tomb, code, symbol, an ancient network of signs engraved in the darkness to keep a faith alive. Let's open that door now. If your brain is boiling and you keep watching the video, yes, this channel is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss the next turn down this rabbit hole. And tell me, in what part of the world are you right now? And what time is it? Are you deciphering Vatican secrets in your lunch hour? Or is it 2 a.m., and you can't sleep? I want to know that. The hidden gospels and their destruction or suppression. In the shadow of the martyrdom of Pedro and the uncertain fate of the bones of Pablo, something else was developing silently, invisibly beneath the surface of early Christian Roma. Something as fragile as papyrus and as explosive as heresy. Writings, parchments, letters, testimonies, scriptures that did not make it into the final version. The hidden gospels and their fate are one of the most tempting, maddening, and unresolvable mysteries in the history of the Vatican. Let's begin with the facts. The canonical New Testament contains 4 gospels: Matthew, Marcos, Lucas, and Juan. These were not the only written gospels. They were the chosen ones, and their selection from among dozens of others was neither immediate nor universal. It took centuries of debate, councils, power plays, and silences to consolidate the Bible we now take for granted. But what was lost during the process? We know from surviving references that many other gospels circulated in the early Christian communities. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of Judas. The list goes on. Some of these texts were discovered in the modern era, specifically at Nag Hammadi in 1945, when a cache of Gnostic manuscripts was unearthed in the Egyptian desert. Others are known only through quotes in the writings of the early church fathers, who denounced them as heretical. But here's the twist. Rome was not only the seat of imperial power, it became the center for exchange of orthodoxy. And defining that orthodoxy meant not only preserving certain texts, but actively destroying others. The early church was not a unified body. It was a fractal of sects, factions, and theological dividing lines. Some groups believed in a purely spiritual Christ who never suffered. Others claimed Jesus was completely human and not divine. Some elevated Mary Magdalene to apostle status. Others wrote about cosmic battles between eons and archons. And many of these beliefs were written on parchments, on codices, on pieces of papyrus that were passed from hand to hand in markets and in the clandestine communities of Rome. What happened to them? The short answer is they disappeared. The long answer is more complex and disturbing. Between the 2nd and 4th centuries A.D.C., the church went from a persecuted, marginal group to a structured institution. And like any institution, it needed to control the narrative, doctrine, and scriptures. That meant deciding which texts were inspired and which were heretical. The process wasn't simple. There was no single council that created the Bible, nor any papal edict that decided everything. Instead, there was gradual, relentless pressure from bishops, councils, emperors, and theologians seeking to unify belief under a single applicable framework. And the price of that unification was not only the elimination, but the destruction and suppression. The texts were condemned, burned, buried, and censored. In some cases, the names of their authors were erased from history. Scribes were forbidden from copying them. The libraries were purged. Heretics were excommunicated, some executed, and the hidden gospels silenced. But were they ever in Rome? That is the crux of it. Nag Hammadi was in Egypt. Other manuscripts appeared in Syria, Ethiopia, and Greece. But what about the Vatican Hill? What about the heart of Christianity? The archaeological records are frustratingly scarce. No hidden libraries have been discovered under St. Peter's. No caches of forbidden scrolls have appeared in the Vatican necropolis. But absence isn't proof, and silence itself is suspicious. Because if anyone had the means, motive, and opportunity to systematically erase alternative scriptures, it was Rome. And what better place to hide or destroy the evidence than under the very basilica that declared orthodoxy victorious? There are rumors, unconfirmed reports from the 16th and 17th centuries, that speak of strange texts discovered during renovations. Letters that didn't match the canonical Gospels, fragments in Aramaic and Greek that referred to unnamed apostles. According to reports, Vatican scholars examined them, and then nothing. No publications, no statements, no further mention. Even today, conspiracy theories swirl around the secret archive of the Vatican, renamed the Apostolic Archive for public relations purposes. It is one of the most jealously guarded collections of documents on Earth. More than 80 kilometers of shelves, thousands of documents still uncatalogued or inaccessible. To access them requires a doctorate, a formal application, and, often, a waiting list that lasts for years. So what could still be hidden in the shadows? Some scholars believe that Rome had copies of the Gnostic texts, possibly intercepted in Egypt or Syria. Others suggest that the first Christian factions in Rome produced alternative gospels, later suppressed by the emerging orthodoxy. After all, Peter and Paul were not the only voices. The city was full of apostles, prophets, and teachers, many anonymous and unregistered. What if one of them had written their visions? What if those writings had been buried during the first persecutions or hidden in catacombs? What if they had been discovered during later constructions and kept secret? The official position of the Church is that there are no such texts in the Vatican archives, that all known Gospels outside the canon are already available to scholars, and that nothing is hidden. But we're talking about the Vatican. Its silence is part of its mystique, and what is at stake is enormous. Because these lost Gospels offer more than theological alternatives. They offer a different Jesus, a different church, a different story of the origins. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, contains no crucifixion, no resurrection, only sayings and teachings. A Zen Jesus who offers riddles instead of redemption. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene as the apostle of the apostles, directly challenged by Peter. The Gospel of Judas gives a complete twist to the story of the betrayal, presenting Judas not as a traitor, but as the one who understood. These are not footnotes. They are threats. threats to the carefully crafted story that became the basis for Catholic theology. And that is why its fate in Rome remains shrouded in mystery. It is not just about history, it is about power. The control of the text is the control of truth. And in ancient Rome, the truth was not only theological, but political. The gospel was not just good news. It was the law. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, what if a single hidden gospel had survived, buried in a sealed chamber, misfiled, hidden in the spine of an old codex, mislabeled as a book of Gregorian chants? What would it reveal? A new apostle, a lost parable, a Jesus who laughed, a Mary who led? Would it destroy or deepen faith? Because even now the question remains unanswered. The silence isn't absolute. There are still corners of the Vatican that have not been excavated. There are still vaults that have not been digitized. There are still whispers that echo through the marble halls. And under the ancient streets of Rome, another type of gospel continues to survive, not in ink, but in stone. Symbols, codes, hidden languages carved into the catacombs. The first Christians may have lost their books, but they wrote on the walls. The secret symbols and cryptography of the early Christian catacombs. Under the streets of Rome lies another city. It is not marked on any map. No emperor ever claimed it. No legion ever marched through its corridors. This city was sculpted by hands that feared the light and trusted death more than the open air. It is a city of tombs, tunnels, and silence, excavated from the tufa rock in slow, painful layers. The catacombs. To the inexperienced eye, they seem like ancient cemeteries. Long corridors of niches aligned wall to wall with the dead. But to those who look closely, very closely, they are much more. A language, a code, a hidden record of the first Christian communities recorded and painted on the bones of the underworld. Because when you cannot speak freely, you write in the shadows. Let's begin with the symbols. The fish, the anchor, the chiro, the shepherd, the dove, the peacock, the praying figure with arms raised. At first glance, they seem like innocent decorations, comforting motifs for mourning families. But they were not merely aesthetic adornments. They were messages, compressed theology, visual passwords. Let's consider the fish. It seems simple, like a child's drawing. Two arcs that intersect to form an almond shape, but it is a code. The Greek word for fish, ichthyes, is an acronym for Isis Christos Theou Huios Soter, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. A doctrinal load in 5 easy-to-draw letters, easy to remember, and impossible for Roman patrols to understand. Then there is the anchor, at first a fairly common symbol of hope in Roman art, but which for Christians served as a disguised cross, a way of referring to the resurrection without provoking execution. A symbol that allowed the faithful to mark their dead without running the risk of suffering the same fate. And the chiro, a fusion of the first 2 letters of Christos in Greek, X and P. It looks like a strange crucifix, but it predates the standard of Constantine. It was used by clandestine Christians to indicate the presence of the faithful, to guide travelers through the labyrinth of tombs, to say, "You are not alone, it wasn't just graffiti." It was a means of survival. And beyond the symbols, there were codes in the text. The first Christian inscriptions in the catacombs employed abbreviations and symbolic numbers. DM, for example, a common Roman prefix on the tombs dis manibus to the spirits of the dead, was sometimes reversed or omitted completely. Christians did not dedicate tombs to pagan spirits. They repurposed the formula. Sometimes the inscriptions were in Latin, sometimes in Greek, occasionally in a mixture of both, written in what scholars call Greek-Holotin, a linguistic fusion that reflects the multicultural composition of the early Christian world. And then there is numerology. The number 3 appears constantly. 3 doves, 3 fish, 3 stars representing the Trinity. The number 8 also appears, symbolizing rebirth and resurrection. Baptismal fonts were octagonal. So were some catacombs. Why? Because in Genesis, God created the world in 6 days. He rested on the 7th day, the 8th day. That is the day outside of time, the day of the new creation, the day of Christ's resurrection. The walls of the catacombs are painted with stories, but coded. The Good Shepherd carrying a lamb, Jonah being swallowed and spat out by a sea monster, Daniel in the lion's den. They were not just comforting stories from the Bible. They were veiled allusions to the resurrection, of divine protection, of a God who liberates. Even the location of these images was important. They were often painted near the entrances or intersection signs in a literal underground labyrinth, a guide for the faithful who came to mourn, pray, or hide. And speaking of labyrinths, some scholars believe that the layout of the catacombs was itself a spiritual map. The further you go in, the more you immerse yourself in the earth, and the more sacred the space becomes. The oldest and most revered tombs are usually the most hidden. The tombs of martyrs are buried at the end of corridors, behind false walls, under layers of later burials. Why? To protect them, but also to reflect the Christian journey. The descent to death followed by resurrection. Even the architecture speaks. But what about cryptography? Is it possible that the first Christians used real ciphers, encrypted text, to communicate? Yes and no. There is no definitive evidence of codes in the style of Caesar, nor inscriptions in the catacombs, nor substitute alphabets, nor hidden keys, but there's a veiled language, euphemisms, word games and puns that only the initiated could understand. For example, dream for death, peace for martyrdom, victory for a brutal execution. In a catacomb, a mosaic represents Jesus without a cross, but as a beardless philosopher holding a scroll. In another, a woman appears in an attitude of prayer, flanked by birds under stars that form a constellation. For a Roman, this might seem mystical or neutral, but for a Christian, it was the Virgin Maria, the Church, or the soul awaiting resurrection. This ambiguity was intentional. It allowed Christians to commemorate their dead, express their faith, and communicate with each other without provoking the wrath of Rome. But was it enough? Not always. We have evidence that the Roman authorities sometimes raided the catacombs in search of smuggling suspects or leaders. Some inscriptions show signs of names erased with an eraser, disfigured symbols. Other tombs were sealed hastily, left incomplete, and yet the network continued to grow. Over time, the Roman catacombs stretched for tens of kilometers. San Sebastian, San Calixto, Doatila, Priscilla. Generations of Christians were buried here, many of them anonymously. Some with titles, presbyter, deacon, bishop, others with names that disappeared from history, but left behind a symbol. The fish, the anchor, the Chiro. They were not mere decorations. They were statements. Identity engraved in stone. Theology compressed into images. Faith encrypted to survive. And even today, not all the symbolism of the catacombs is understood. New rooms are still being discovered. New inscriptions, faint and half-buried, are being re-examined with ultraviolet light and 3D scanners. Some believe that there are entire crypts still sealed, lost in collapses, forgotten in reconstructions, waiting in silence. Imagine what they hide. A new symbol, a forgotten code, a mural that rewrites the history of early Christian worship. Because if they encoded their faith in symbols, what else did they hide? The question persists because beyond the murals and mosaics, in the depths of the bones of the hill, something even more mysterious is hidden. Something that is not only hidden, but lost. The martyrs. Countless Christians died in those early centuries, but many were buried without a name. Their tombs are only marked with the word martyr, without any other indication. Who were they? What were their stories? Let's try to find them. The unidentified martyrs of the Roman catacombs. Rome is a city of names. It always has been. From the golden inscriptions that surround the triumphal arches to the marble tombs that proclaim lineage and legacy, the Romans recorded their presence in stone. Names were identity. They were the power itself. That your name was remembered was to defy death, to continue living on in time. But in the catacombs, there are thousands of tombs where the names are missing. In its place, only the word martyr is found. Sometimes, not even that much. Only a symbol, a fish, a palm leaf, a flame, a small scratch of a half-faded scribble, and then silence. Who were these people, anyway? Why were they anonymous? What happened to their names, then? It is one of the great unspoken wounds of early Christian history. This vast underworld of nameless dead. Men, women, children, slaves, soldiers, foreigners, Romans. All buried in the labyrinth beneath the city. All killed for a faith not yet fully defined. All forgotten by history, even when the church for which they died rose above their bones. Let's begin with the figures. Modern scholars estimate there are more than 6 million burials in the Roman catacombs. Not all Christians, of course, but among them are tens of thousands of Christian tombs scattered throughout 60 known catacombs. And among them, a large percentage are marked with the term martyr without any personal identifier. Some are grouped in what appear as mass graves hastily dug into the walls and floor. Others are set apart, surrounded by devotional graffiti, votive lamps, or rudimentary altars suggesting veneration by early Christian pilgrims. But they remain nameless still. Why is that? There are several reasons, each more disturbing than the last one. First, many of these martyrs were poor, illiterate, or slaves. They had no families to commission inscriptions, nor the means to pay for carved epitaphs. Their identities, like their lives, were erased by social class and circumstance. Second, the persecution was chaotic then. When Christians were gathered and executed, it was often done en masse and without regard for individual identity. Entire groups were martyred together then. The bodies were thrown into pits there. If the survivors managed to recover the remains, they often could not distinguish who was who, so they buried what they could, marked the place, and left it in memory. Third, there was secrecy. Giving names in an era of persecution was very dangerous. An inscription could become a clue to Roman authorities. A name engraved in stone could provoke new raids then. Silence, in this case, was protection not only for the dead, but for the living too. And finally, there was ideology. Early Christianity venerated anonymity itself. The idea that one could die for Christ without recognition was considered a form of spiritual purity then. Martyrdom was not about fame, but about pure faith. To die without a name was to echo Christ's humility, to reflect the silence of his suffering. But that changed over time. In the 4th century, as Christianity gained legal status and then imperial favor, the memory of the martyrs became valuable from a political and theological viewpoint. Names were assigned retroactively then. Hagiographies were then written. Fiction was mixed in with reality. The church needed saints, role models, heroes, so meaning was sought in the anonymous tombs within the catacombs. Sometimes the bones were exhumed and moved, relics were created, and the martyrs were given names matching the liturgical calendar. Complete biographies were built from a single line of graffiti or a misinterpreted image. Santa Cecilia, Santa Ines, San Sebastian. Were those their actual names? Perhaps. But in many cases, they were reconstructed from a mosaic of legends, tradition, theology, and imagination, sewn together to create something recognizable by the faithful. Which leaves us with the terrible possibility that many of the most famous saints of the church could be built on the bones of strangers, and that the truly anonymous martyrs, those without inscriptions, without stories, without festivities, have been silenced forever, but not entirely, because something still remains. In the catacombs of San Calixto, there is a long corridor known as the Crypt of the Popes. In it, several pontiffs of the 3rd century are buried next to each other. Most have names, but some do not. Their tombs are marked only by symbols or partial inscriptions. Were they popes? Were they victims of persecution? Or were their remains simply misidentified in later centuries? In the catacombs of Doatilla, there's a fresco of 3 women in praying poses with their arms raised. There are no names, only painted forms, soft and warm by time. Some say they represent the Virgin Mary. Others say they are the 3 theological virtues. But what if they were real women? Martyrs buried nearby, remembered in pigments because stone was too expensive. And in the catacomb of Priscilla, under layers of later burials, there is a small room with crude carvings, a dove, a palm branch, a broken jug, no text, no names, only symbols of death and peace. Who lies there? A child, a woman, a slave. The answers are locked in the bones, and the bones have not been asked. Most of the catacombs have never been fully excavated. Some corridors are too unstable. Others are sealed. A few have been completely lost, collapsed, built on top, forgotten. It is estimated that at least 40% of the known Roman catacomb network remains unexplored or inaccessible, meaning thousands of unopened tombs, thousands of unread stories. DNA tests, where they have been allowed, have begun to reveal some clues. In some cases, the skeletal remains have shown signs of violence. Cuts, fractures, trauma consistent with executions. Other remains show signs of malnutrition, disease, and forced labor. They were not rich people. They were survivors and then martyrs. But of the vast majority, there is no record. No parchments, no plaques, just stone, dust, and silence. So what does the church do with them? In a sense, it canonizes them all. There is a festivity in the Catholic liturgical calendar known as All Saints' Day, followed by All Souls' Day. The first honors the named saints, the second the anonymous, the forgotten, the unknown martyrs buried in Roma and around the world. But liturgy is not memory, and although the Vaticano honors the concept, the bones remain untouched. Perhaps rightly so, but perhaps not. Because what if there are clues under the catacombs? Inscriptions yet to be deciphered? Carvings earlier than the ones we know? Crypts that were not sealed by accident, but on purpose? To protect, to preserve, to hide? What if the unknown martyrs are truly unknown? Not only for persecution, but for power. Because the next layer of mystery has nothing to do with catacombs. It is about what happened after. When Constantine legalized Christianity and built St. Peter's first basilica, his engineers faced a challenge: how to honor the ancient martyrs without destroying them. And so, they built upon them. But how they did it is another mystery. A mystery of stone and slope, of ambition and architecture. A mystery that still remains buried beneath the high altar of the modern Vatican. Let's go down again, this time to its foundations. The construction techniques of St. Peter's first basilica. In the year 313 D.C., the Roman Empire took a radical turn. The Edict of Milan, issued by Emperors Constantine and Licinius, declared Christians free to practice their worship. Thus, without further ado, 3 centuries of blood and secrets collapsed under imperial decree. The midnight baptisms and aqueducts were over. The keywords written in graffiti and catacombs were over. The whispered prayers and shadow of execution were over. Christianity was now legal. But Constantine was not satisfied with mere tolerance. He turned it sacred. He imagined a church not as a marginal meeting of the oppressed, but as an imperial monument. And for this he needed more than policies. He needed stone. He needed space. He needed to build something big. So big that it would redefine an entire religion. Not in the dusty basement of Rome, but in its highest and most spiritual place. And so, at some point between 319 and 324 A.D.C., Constantine ordered construction of a basilica on the Vatican Hill. Not just any basilica. The basilica, the original St. Peter's, built not in the city center, but on its margins. Built not on a temple, but on a tomb. The tomb, the end of Peter, or at least the place everyone believed to be Peter's tomb. But this is where history abandons marble and enters mystery. Because what Constantine's builders did was not only extraordinary, it was almost impossible. They had to build a basilica atop a hill that was not flat. A hill plagued with tombs, sepulchres, mausoleums, and Roman necropolises. A hill sacred to both memory and decay. A hill that was never intended to bear the weight of the most sacred structure of an empire. And yet, somehow, they succeeded. Let's start with ground. The Vatican Hill was not smooth. It had an irregular slope from north to south. The area destined for the basilica was crossed by cemeteries, including the ancient necropolis that we now know lies just below the current St. Peter's Basilica. Roman law prohibited burials inside the city walls. So the hill had become a city of the dead, full of family tombs, pagan monuments, and supposedly the apostles' tomb itself. If Constantino had chosen a blank canvas, it would be easier. But he chose sacred ground, and sacred ground cannot be razed. So the builders did something that no one expected. They razed the ground. Instead of excavating the hill, they built a huge retaining wall around the area, and then filled the entire slope with earth and rubble. They created an artificial platform, a flat terrace, on which to place the basilica's foundations. Think about it. Tons of earth, rocks, and debris moved by hand. No cranes, no excavators, just workers with shovels carrying the hill towards itself, raising foundations that floated above the dead. And not just any foundations, but very specific foundations. Because Constantino not only wanted to build a church near Pedro's tomb, he wanted to build it directly above. Moreover, he wanted the altar, the sacred center of Christian liturgy, to rest precisely on the apostles' bones. It was not merely symbolic. It was strategic. The church's legitimacy was now inseparable from its architecture. Pedro's martyrdom was its cornerstone. And Constantino, a brilliant politician, understood that a structure built on Pedro's body was not just a church. It was a throne. But how did they find the tomb? This is where the records are lost to tradition. According to early Christian memory, Pedro had been buried in the catacombs, near the catacombs along the Via Cornelia. Caius, the presbyter, had described a trophy built on the tomb, probably the gastropion, a modest monument that stood on the apostles' bones. If that is true, then Constantino's architects had some reference point. And yet, no maps, architectural plans, or diaries are preserved. Only this, a five-nave basilica, more than 100 meters long, built directly on the necropolis, with its main altar located on a specific point of the ancient cemetery. The place is now called the Confiziata Hollow, below the current altar, where visitors can go down a few steps and look through a glass panel at the sanctuary below. And this is where things get even stranger. Because the basilica's construction was not careful. It was brutal. Much of the necropolis was destroyed during the leveling process. The mausoleums were crushed. The tombs were sealed under tons of earth. Entire families were buried under a single imperial vision. In some places, the Christian tombs remained intact. In others, the pagan ones were destroyed. Why this inconsistency? Some say it was for practical reasons. Constantino's workers simply filled in everything that stood in their way. Others believe that there was some kind of surgical preservation effort around Pedro's tomb, a sacred core carefully preserved amid destruction. In any case, the result was a paradox. The basilica was both a monument to memory and an erasure of memory. It honored the dead by burying them again, this time under a monument so huge that it could never be questioned. The structure itself was impressive. A huge wooden roof supported by rows of marble columns, mostly reused from pagan temples. A narthex, a transept, an elevated cloister that flooded the nave with light. In the center, the altar, and below, the memory of a fisherman who had become rock. But the design was not entirely Roman. It was hybrid. A basilica in Roman architecture was a hollow public place intended for courts, markets, or administration. Constantine adopted that design for Christian worship, turning a secular form into sacred space. Why not build a temple? Because Christian worship did not consist of housing a god. It was about gathering people, the long nave, the central axis, the emphasis on the altar. Everything was designed to channel attention toward the relic under Peter. And yet, the details of that relic were never publicly shown. No bones were exhibited. No reliquary was unveiled. The tomb was buried deep, hidden behind layers of marble and myth. Only a few could see it. Only a few knew exactly where it was. And as centuries passed, even that knowledge faded. The original basilica stood for over 1,000 years. It survived fires, looting, and renovations. It witnessed the coronation of Charlemagne and the medieval evolution of papal power. In the 15th century, it was in ruins. Pope Julius II ordered its demolition and replacement with the Renaissance masterpiece we know today. But in doing so, the builders faced the ancient dilemma again. How do you build on a tomb without disturbing it? How to honor the past while literally burying it? In the 20th century, when archaeologists were finally able to excavate under the basilica, they found what Constantine's builders had left: the necropolis, the red wall, the tropaeon, and perhaps Peter's bones. But they also found broken tombs, crushed inscriptions, ghosts of memory sealed in concrete. So what did Constantine achieve? He built a church. He built the church and, in doing so, consolidated a theological geography that endures today. Every pope, every liturgy, every doctrine has its roots literally in the foundations Constantine laid. But how much did he know? Did he see Peter's bones? Did his priests see them? Did they move them, protect them, touch them? We do not know. And that silence is as heavy as marble. Because, as much as Constantine gave to Christianity, he also obscured it. His basilica preserved the faith, but blurred the facts. What was once an open-air tomb became an altar. What was once a necropolis became a footnote. But Constantine did not stop with Peter. He built basilicas for other saints, other tombs, other imperial gestures of faith, including one that remains lost. Because while the location of his own burial is debated, there's another mausoleum in Rome that historians continue to discuss, one that he himself may have built, or one built for him, hidden, misidentified, perhaps even under our feet. Let's look for Constantine's tomb. The location of Constantine's original tomb, or mausoleum in Rome. It is one of history's great ironies. The emperor who converted Christianity from an illegal sect into an imperial religion. The man who erected basilicas over the tombs of the saints and planted crosses where the Caesars once ruled, left no clear tomb for himself. In the city, he transformed. Constantine the Great, first Christian emperor, founder of a new Rome in the East, builder of churches that would last a millennium. And yet, in Rome itself, the question persists: where is his tomb? The official story says, not here. According to contemporary and almost contemporary accounts, Constantine was buried in Constantinople, the new capital, the city to which he gave his name, the new Rome that shifted the empire's axis to the east. There, in the Church of the Holy Apostles, it was deposited in a sarcophagus surrounded by 12 empty crosses, symbolically representing the apostles themselves. A 13th apostle in imperial form. It is poetic. It is political. It is theological theater in its maximum expression. And, nevertheless, the history is not closed because before constructing Constantinople, before turning his eyes towards the Bosporus, Constantine governed from the west, from Milan, from Trier, and, yes, from Rome. And in Rome, something does not fit. Let's go back. Constantine visited Rome several times during his reign. He sponsored vast construction projects, not only the Basilica of St. Peter, but also the Lateran complex, which would become the papal residence centuries before the Vatican acquired political power. He also built mausoleums. We know one of them, the Mausoleum of Helena, his mother, which is still preserved today. Its circular shape and enormous brick walls are visible in the Tor Pignata neighborhood, southeast of Rome. Built around the year 329 AD, it was part of a larger complex that included the Basilica of Santi Marcellino and Pietro. The tomb of Helena, with its porphyry sarcophagus, was luxurious, worthy of the mother of an emperor. But why build a mausoleum for his mother in Rome if he intended to abandon the West? Why not wait for Constantinople? Unless that was not the original plan. This is where the mystery deepens. Some ancient sources suggest that Constantine intended to be buried in Rome. There are small indications, dispersed and often discarded, in the writings of Ushio and in the marginalia of later chroniclers. A mausoleum near the Lateran and the imperial plans to build a family funerary complex are mentioned. And then there is the Lateran itself. Before the Vatican became the papal seat, the Lateran was the Christian center of Rome. Constantine donated the land. There he built the original basilica. What today is the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran, the Cathedral of the Bishop of Rome. Some scholars believe that next to it, there was a mausoleum destined for Constantine himself. Not only symbolic, but literal. There are ruins and foundations near the ancient baptistry of Lateran that suggest a circular structure similar in design to the mausoleum of Helena. The brickwork dates from the time of Constantine. Its location next to the church and the palace suggests an imperial intention, but no definitive inscription has confirmed it as his tomb. So what happened? Why did Constantine plan to be buried in Rome and then choose Constantinople? The moment. The construction of the Church of the Holy Apostles began at the end of his reign. It was not finished until after his death in the year 337 A.D.C. Constantine died near Nicomedia, in present-day Turkey, not in Rome, not even in Constantinople, and his body was transported, embalmed and processed with all the imperial splendor, first to Constantinople and then to the newly consecrated church. But was it the original plan or a political turn? Perhaps we will never know. Some historians believe that the burial of Constantine in Constantinople was a posthumous measure by his successors, especially his son Constantius II, to strengthen Christian legitimacy in the East. Others argue that Constantine always intended to be buried there, and that the Roman mausoleums were backup plans, decoys, or perhaps abandoned dreams. But that does not explain the disappearance of the tomb, since the Church of the Holy Apostles no longer exists. It was demolished by the Ottomans after the fall of Constantinople and replaced by the Fatih Mosque in the 15th century. The site has never been fully excavated. The sarcophagi that were there have disappeared, been looted, destroyed, or lost. Confirmed remains of Constantine have never been located. His imperial sarcophagus, carved in stone and large, has disappeared. Some claim parts of it are in the Vatican museums. Others believe it was destroyed during the sack of Constantinople. Others say that it was moved to a safer place, perhaps Rome. It may seem far-fetched, but consider this. In the 18th century, during renovation work near Latran, a sealed chamber was discovered under the baptistry. Inside were fragments of a red coffin, destroyed and mixed in earth, without inscriptions or documentation. The pieces were collected discreetly and moved into a warehouse. Some are now in museums. The location of others is unknown. Could these have belonged to Constantine? We do not know. No tests have been done. No formal connection has been made. But the stone matches the type used for imperial sarcophagi. The location fits. The time fits. The mystery remains. And there is more. The Vatican's own records, voluminous, secret, and often incomplete, contain scattered mentions of imperial tombs near Latran. The inventories of the 9th and 10th centuries speak of mausoleums that no longer exist. Some even refer to the bones of the great emperor, unnamed. Could it be Constantine or another? Here is a disturbing question. If Constantine was buried in Rome, even briefly, what happened to his body? Was it moved? Did the growing importance of Constantinople necessitate a relocation? Or was the Roman tomb simply left empty, unfinished, and symbolic, a monument to a plan that never was completed? Today, pilgrims walk through Latran without realizing what could lie buried underfoot. Tourists marvel at the basilica's Baroque splendor, without knowing that under the baptistry lies a half-forgotten ruin, a circle of bricks, a few steps, a void. The tomb of the first Christian emperor has disappeared. And perhaps it is appropriate, because Constantine's legacy is as divided as his burial. Saint for some, usurper to others. A man who saw a cross in the sky and changed the world, but left ambiguity in his wake. Without bones, epitaph, or sanctuary, only ruins. But right at the foot of the Leyden Hill, even deeper in the memory of the city, another name endures. A monument not to an emperor, but to a fisherman. A man whose tomb Constantine immortalized, even though he himself might have lost track of his own. Peter. And not far from Peter, between the vaults and crypts of Rome, sleeps another structure, small, silent, lost to time. It is called the Tropino, and nobody really knows what it was. The true form of the Tropino of gas. In the silence between legend and archaeology, between martyrdom and monument, In its stanza stood a fundamental structure, forgotten. It was not a basilica. It was not a church. It was not even a chapel in the traditional Roman sense. It was a tropion, a trophy, a sanctuary, a whisper built from stone. And it may have been the first Christian monument of Rome. It is called the Tropion of Gas, and we have never seen it. Let's begin with the only clue we have left. A quote. At some point in the late 2nd century, a Roman Christian named Gas was involved in a theological dispute with a certain Proclus, a Montanist of those charismatic sectarians who claimed to receive divine revelations directly, inconveniently, and without clerical supervision. To defend his position, Gas did something radical. He quoted archaeology. If you go to the Vatican or the Austrian Road, Gas wrote, you will find the trophies of the founders of this church. Trophies. Tropy alpha, iota alpha. Not tombs, nor churches, but trophies. One on the Vatican Hill for Peter, another on the Austrian Road for Paul. And with those words, he anchored the Christian tradition to a physical space. He turned Peter and Paul from legends into places. But what did he mean by trophy? In Roman culture, a trophy was a battle monument, a display of enemy armor and weapons hung on a wooden frame and left standing in sight of victory. It was a declaration of conquest, both symbolic and ephemeral. So what happens when the first persecuted and clandestine Christians appropriate that language? They turn the vision of execution into a battlefield. They make martyrdom the very moment of victory. The trophy is no longer the armor, but memory. Peter's tomb became the Christian tropium, a small, rough monument to the triumph of the apostles through death. But what did it look like? This is where things become confusing. The Gas tropion is not mentioned in any other ancient text. He left no plans, no illustrated manuscripts, no sketches of the first pilgrims. All we have is a name, a location, and a trail of archaeological crumbs buried under 20 meters of Vatican marble. And yet, in the 20th century, those crumbs began to resurface. In 1939, workers carrying out renovation work under St. Peter's Basilica accidentally discovered a Roman-era necropolis under the high altar. During the following decade, a team of archaeologists working secretly under the orders of the Vatican excavated a narrow strip of this necropolis and ended up discovering a red-painted plaster wall behind the high altar. It was the Red Wall. Behind it, a simple empty niche now flanked by columns. Above, fragments of decorative plaster. Below, a complex of burials and architectural remains, including a marble-lined deposit containing human bones. Some Vatican scholars believe that this red wall, with its niche, is part of the Gas tropion. That this is the monument he described, that this small architectural element built roughly and later covered in marble by Constantine was once the physical heart of Christian Rome, but others disagree. The problem is that no one knows what the tropion looked like. Some believe it was a freestanding structure, perhaps an aedicule, a small shrine with a gabled roof and columns. Others argue that it was simply a tomb marked with an inscription or a symbol indicating Peter's tomb. Others suggest that it may have resembled a Roman sepulchrum, a low, cylindrical, or rectangular stone marker, often used in funerary contexts. And then there is the possibility that it was never a structure, that the word tropion was metaphorical, that Guise was not referring to a physical building, but to the memory of a martyrdom, that the place itself in itself, Peter's tomb, was the trophy. But if that is the case, why did Constantine build a basilica upon it? Why was the site preserved so precisely? Why do the layers of architecture converge at that point? Because there was something there. Maybe it was small. Maybe it was insignificant by Roman standards. But for the early Christians, it was everything. A place to pray, to mourn, to remember. A point of convergence between earth and sky. And maybe that's why Constantine left it intact. When they built the original basilica, its architects did not remove the red wall. They built all around it. They preserved the vertical alignment from the tomb up to the altar. They built a platform raising the entire structure above him, enveloping the place in layers of protection and reverence. The subsequent renovations during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance continued this trend. The place remained hidden, but never desecrated, forgotten, yet never destroyed. Layer after layer of stone and liturgy were piled up until the tropion itself disappeared into a geological mystery. We know that the Red Wall, which dates from the 2nd century, presents a niche-shaped structure with architectural ornaments typical of Roman funerary monuments. We know that a collection of bones was found nearby, belonging to a man between 60 and 70 years old who was missing his feet, which is consistent with the traditional narration of the crucifixion and burial of Peter. And we know that the Vatican, in 1968, declared that these bones were, in all probability, the remains of the Apostle Peter. But no definitive image of the tropion has been recovered yet. There is no fragment with the word Petro. There is no inscription that says tropion. There is only indirect evidence, architectural indications, and devotion. And perhaps that is appropriate, because the tropion was never intended to impress the eye. Its goal was to anchor the soul. It was not an imperial declaration. It was a protest, a challenge, a declaration that death had been defeated by someone who once said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And if the church is the house, the tropion was its cornerstone. Small, rough, invisible, but unwavering. Even so, ambiguity persists. Could there have been other tropea in Rome, small sanctuaries dedicated to other martyrs, destroyed or converted long ago? Did the term refer to a broader commemorative culture, marking sacred places with something more than bones? And if so, how many more have been lost? Because just as the tropion disappeared into the foundations of the basilica, so did the homes, meeting places, and the very lives of the first bishops of Rome. Before Latran, before the palaces, where did they live? Where did the popes go before they had a throne? The first papal residences. Before Latran, before golden mitres existed, before white chasubles and the pope mobiles, before the keys of Peter were printed on flags and placed on bronze doors, there was only one man. A man in Rome, often persecuted, sometimes hidden, almost always poor, who guided a scattered flock without a palace, without an altar, and, most importantly, without a home. Because in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the Bishop of Rome, what we call the Pope today, did not live in a palace. He lived in shadow. And where exactly those shadows fell is one of the most unknown and fascinating mysteries in Vatican history. The question of the first papal residences. Where did the first popes really live? Where did they govern, write, exercise their ministry, mourn, and in many cases, prepare to die? Let's start at beginning. According to church tradition, the first bishops of Rome began with Peter. After him came Leonis Anacletus, sometimes divided into Cleto and Anacleto, Clementi, and a chain of successors that extended throughout the bloody centuries of the Roman Empire. These men, although not yet emperors in robes, were nevertheless the heads of a flourishing and highly illegal religious movement, which means that their residences were not grandiose. They were mobile, improvised, and deliberately obscure. It assumes that the first bishops of Rome, especially in the pre-Constantinian period, approximately between 64 and 313 AD, lived or operated from a rotating network of domestic churches, called Domus Ecclesiae, spread throughout the poorest neighborhoods of the city. These were private houses converted into places of worship, invisible from the street, often camouflaged and, on occasion, only partially dedicated to Christian use. And that was if they were lucky. More often, the first popes lived as fugitives. They moved constantly. They met with their followers in clandestine cemeteries. They baptized converts in cisterns and alleys. They wrote letters by candlelight and passed them from hand to hand between trusted messengers. The Roman state took care of it. From the persecutions of Nero in the 1st century to the repression of Valerian in the 3rd, any bishop of Rome was a priority target, and many were arrested, exiled, or executed. Leonis was martyred. Eclius was martyred. Clementi was martyred. It is said he was tied to an anchor and drowned in the Black Sea from a year 64 AD. Until 313 AD. Almost half of all the Roman bishops met a violent end, and they did so without ever having governed from an official ecclesiastical headquarters. So, how do we know where they lived? The answer is, with much great care. There are fragments of information, scattered references in the first Christian texts, inscriptions in catacombs, indications of the Liber Pontificalis, a compilation of papal biographies of the 6th century, some based more on hagiography than real facts. From these we know some things. In the first place, there is a tradition possibly near to the reality that Pedro himself lived in the Trastevere neighborhood on the west bank of the Tiber. This area, densely populated and full of merchants and immigrants, would have offered anonymity. The archaeological excavations under the Church of San Crisostomo have discovered Paleo-Christian tombs and a domus ecclesiae that dates from the end of the 2nd century or the beginning of the 3rd. Could have been used by an early pope? It is possible. Then there is the Titulus Clementis, now the Basilica de San Clemente. This complex includes a Roman house of the 1st century below a church of the 4th century, with a distribution that suggests Christian use. A fresco represents Clemente, the 3rd or 4th pope, according to the list, and the first legends connect him directly with the place. Was this his house, or simply a posthumous dedication? Once again, we do not know. In the catacombs of Priscilla, on the Via Salaria, there is a small chamber with graffiti that make reference to Pope Marcelino, who reigned at the end of the 3rd century. Near the catacombs of Calixtus is a series of crypts known as the Crypt of the Popes. There, 9 pontiffs of the 2nd and 3rd centuries were buried, which suggests a certain level of stability and recognition among the community. But burial is not the same as residence. And the truth is that the confirmed location of a papal house prior to the Lateran has never been discovered. This leads to a fascinating and somewhat disturbing possibility that the first popes did not have a fixed residence, that they lived like their flock, dispersed, secret, perpetually fleeing, that the man who one day would become the most powerful religious figure on earth was once a tenant in borrowed rooms, eating bread that could have been his last meal. And, nevertheless, he governed. The first popes were not only symbolic figures. They gave instructions. They coordinated works of charity. They received correspondence from other Christian communities. Corinth, Antioch, Carthage. In some way, they maintained a theological authority, even with the Roman swords over their heads. That type of leadership requires an infrastructure, but not of the type that exists nowadays. Instead of a palace, there are networks. Trusted families that opened their homes, deacons that carried letters, widows that organized prayer meetings, converts that possessed houses big enough to welcome 50 or 60 believers at a time. It was a decentralized papacy, a church of halls and secret keys. And then everything changed. In the year 313 AD, CE, Constantine legalized Christianity. In the year 324 AD, CE, he moved the capital of the empire to Byzantium. In between, he donated a property to the Bishop of Rome on the Lateran Hill. It was not just a gesture, it was a declaration. The church would no longer hide. It would govern. The Lateran Palace became the papal residence for the next 1,000 years. It had its own basilica, its own treasure, its own scribes, guards, archives, and audience halls. From there, the Bishop of Rome became the Pope as we know him, a spiritual monarch with lands, authority, and domicile. But what was lost? The papacy prior to Lateran was humble and local, with its feet on the ground. It existed among the people, not above them. In many ways, it was closer to the original Christian spirit, more apostolic in poverty than power. And yet, we know very little about it, because the Vatican's historical narrative begins with Constantine. Before that, there is fog, gaps, faceless names, residences without records. So, where are the lost papal houses? Some speculate that they are located beneath modern churches. San Clemente, Santa Pudenziana, San Croix. Others believe that they have been destroyed, reused, or buried under centuries of urban expansion. The hills of Roma are layers and layers of oblivion. But maybe the houses never mattered. Maybe the true seat of the Pope was not in stone. Perhaps it was in the people who hid him, fed him, mourned him, the slaves who memorized his letters, the women who sang psalms in the back rooms, the deacons who watched during baptisms and used the baths. Perhaps they were the palace. And perhaps that is why the mystery persists, not because we have lost a building, but because we have lost a way of being. Even so, if we could find one of those first residences, just one room, a plan, an inscription, the history of the origin of the papacy would be rewritten. It would remind us that Peter's throne was once a stool in a kitchen. And just as it was difficult to trace those homes, so is the memory of the man who contributed to making it all necessary. Because long before the popes ruled Roma, another emperor left his mark, Neron. And although his name still resonates in infamy, his body remains missing. The disappearance of the remains of Emperor Neron. In the long gallery of Roman emperors, few figures stand as vividly as Neron. The man who played the lyre while Roma burned. The tyrant who poisoned his stepbrother, stabbed his mother, and kicked his pregnant wife to death. The artist turned pyromaniac. The ruler whose name became synonymous with madness, cruelty, and theatricality. A human paradox, a lover of the arts, and executioner of innocence. But among the crimes, the flames, and the legends, there is a detail that remains unresolved. Where's his body? Emperor Neron Claudio Caesar Augusto Germanico died in June of the year 68 AC. He was 30 years old. He was the last descendant of the Julio-Claudia dynasty, a descendant of Augusto himself. He took his own life in a rented villa on the outskirts of Roma after being declared a public enemy by the Senate. His last words, dramatically recorded by Suetonius, were Qualis artifex perio. One artist dies in me. And he stuck a dagger in his neck. Or maybe he had a servant do it. What followed was chaos. His death ended the Julio-Claudia dynasty and triggered the year of the four emperors. Thus began a whirlwind of civil war, claims, bloodshed, and the eventual rise of Vespasiano, founder of the Flavian dynasty. But before that chapter could begin, something had to be done with Neron's body. And that's where the mystery begins. The standard version of events is more or less this. Nero's body was recovered by a few loyal followers, among them two freedmen called Epaphroditus and Phainand, who gave him burial in the mausoleum of the Domatia in Orbai, the tomb of his paternal family. The place was located on the Pincha Hill, overlooking what today is the Piazza del Popolo. His tomb was marked with a modest monument and, later, supposedly with a small sanctuary cared for by those who continued to venerate him. But here's the problem. That tomb has never been found, not definitively, nor archaeologically, nor publicly recognized. And in a city like Rome, where almost all the tombs of the emperors have been at least identified, if not excavated, that absence is striking, especially considering the damage that Nero caused on the Vatican Hill. Let's pause here, because the persecution of Christians by Nero, his probable execution of Peter and Paul, and his circus of death on the Vatican Hill are central elements of the foundational trauma of the early church in Rome. His memory became a negative foundation. This is what we are not. And yet, his tomb was lost. Why? There are several theories, all obscure. The first, destruction. After the death of Nero, the Roman elite undertook a systematic campaign to erase his legacy. His statues were torn down. His name was erased from the public inscriptions Dam Natio Memoriae, the curse of memory. It was one of the most powerful tools of Roman political revenge. And perhaps his tomb was included. It is very possible that the mausoleum of the Domus Hinobi was desecrated, stripped, burned, buried, that the bones were removed, thrown, scattered, and abandoned to putrefaction in a ditch. No sarcophagus, monument, or inscription has been preserved that definitively links the place with Nero. The erasure may have been total, but history is rarely so clean. Which brings us to the second theory, preservation and secrecy. Despite his monstrous reputation, Nero had followers, especially among the lower classes and certain factions in the East. After his death, a strange personality cult emerged. Coins were minted in Asia Minor with his image. Statues were discreetly preserved in private homes. And in Rome, rumors persisted that he was not really dead, that he would return. This became known as the legend of Nero Redivivus. In the following decades, multiple impostors emerged. claiming to be the resurrected emperor. They gathered armies, marched on cities, and were eventually crushed. But the idea never quite died. Even the Book of Revelation, written at the end of the 1st century, contains veiled references that many scholars interpret as allusions to Nero, the beast whose number is 666, the one who was and is not, and yet is. The early Christians, marked by his persecution, codified Nero in their apocalyptic nightmares. So what does this have to do with his tomb? Everything. Because if it was believed that Nero was going to return, if his death was questioned, if his spirit was feared, it makes sense that his physical remains could be hidden, either by loyalists who hoped for his resurrection or by the state that feared it. Some even believe that the Vatican itself could hide remains of Nero's tomb, buried, built on top of, or misidentified. It is not impossible. We know that the Circus of Nero was located on the Vatican Hill, that Peter was executed there, and that the foundations of the circus are still under the sacred basilica of St. Peter. But what else is down there? Roman circuses were not just arenas. They were complexes. They included observation platforms, stables, sanctuaries, pedestals for statues, and, sometimes, family tombs. If the Barbie had properties on the hill, and they did, it is not unthinkable that there was a secondary tomb or a cenotaph near or inside the circus complex, a place to honor the imperial line. But no trace has appeared, unless the obelisk is counted. The same obelisk that is now in the center of St. Peter's Square once marked the center of Nero's circus. Brought from Egypt by Caligula, it silently witnessed the death of saints and the rise of an empire. It has no inscription, just red granite, 25 m high, a monument without a message, much like Narration himself. And then there's a third theory, that the Vatican knows it. This is where speculation turns to conspiracy, but not without reason. The Vatican is, without doubt, the most complex archaeological site in the world. Under St. Peter lie centuries of burials, ruins, chambers, corridors, many unexplored, some sealed off. The excavations are strictly controlled. The reports are carefully filtered. Is it possible that the tomb of Narration or his remains was discovered, identified, and secretly moved? Without a doubt, and it will make sense to do so. The image of consecrating the bones of the man who murdered Peter under the church that bears his name is problematic, at the very least. But what if those remains were already part of the ground? What if the Vatican, when built on the Vatican Hill, was literally built atop the tomb of Narration? That would be the ultimate inversion. The man who tried to destroy the church becomes the foundation for its greatest cathedral. His blood, his stones, his circus reused, rewritten, redeemed. But without a headstone, without a sarcophagus, we are left with a ghost, an emperor who shaped history, then disappeared into it. A ghost that haunts both Christian memory and Roman myth. And perhaps that is why the Vatican does not want to excavate further. Not because it fears what it will not find, but because it fears what it might find. The tomb of Narration is not just a place, it's a reckoning. And just below that reckoning, beneath the layers of the empire and the basilica, there is still more to discover. More roads, more ruins, structures that do not appear in any tourist guide or on any museum sign. Because the legacy of Narration is just one chapter of the deep labyrinth that hides beneath the Holy See. A network of forgotten roads, chambers, crypts, and walls, some older than the church itself. Let's delve into the dark, unknown structures that sleep under the Vatican. The uncatalogued underground structures under Vatican City. The Vatican is a city on a city, a sovereign microstate wrapped in marble and ritual, built upon layers of sacred space, political power, and forgotten ruins. But under the domes and the guards, beyond the mosaics and museums, something even older awaits. A deeper Rome, a hidden Rome, a buried world of streets, structures, and foundations that predate Christianity itself. And much of it has never been cataloged. Let's begin with what we know. The modern Vatican is located in what was once part of an extensive suburban district of ancient Rome. In the 1st century A.D.C., this area was outside the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city, which made it a perfect place for cemeteries, gardens, and imperial parks. To the south, the Circus of Narration. To the north and west, necropolises with rows of mausoleums that bordered the Via Cornelia, the Via Triumphalis, and other long-gone Roman roads. Under the Basilica of St. Peter, a sloping necropolis rediscovered in the 20th century containing elaborate tombs from the 2nd century A.D.C. These have been partially excavated and can now be visited on official Vatican tours, the so-called scavi, or excavations. But beyond that area, things get confusing because the hill is riddled with ruins. Some known, others suspected, some sealed, and few have been fully explored. Why? There are 3 reasons. First, structural integrity. Excavating under a centuries-old basilica, one of the heaviest and most architecturally complex buildings, is risky. Every excavation carries a risk of collapse, both literal and symbolic. Second, conservation. The ancient walls, frescoes, and sarcophagi are fragile. Exposure to light, air, and humidity can destroy what time has preserved. In third place, most intriguing, is the secret. The Vatican is cautious about its past. Its archaeology is controlled by the Fabbrica di San Pietro, the office responsible for the basilica's maintenance. The excavations are infrequent. The publications are even scarcer. Access is strictly controlled. Many zones remain closed, labeled, or silently ignored. Which raises the question, what else is there below? Let's analyze the possibilities. In first place, the lost Roman roads. In antiquity, the Vatican Hill was crossed by many roads. The Via Cornelia ran roughly east to west along the hillside. The Via Triumphal curved toward the north. They were not simple roads, but vital arteries connecting tombs, villas, temples, and markets. Fragments of these roads have been discovered under the Vatican gardens, behind the Basilica, and near the Teutonic Cemetery, but much remains to be discovered. Are there intact stretches in the depths of the papal apartments, buried under the Apostolic Palace? We don't know. In second place, the Roman villas. After all, it was about the outskirts. Wealthy Romans built villas in the hills on the city's outskirts. Luxurious houses with peristyles, atriums, gardens, and mosaics. Several ruins of this type have been found in the nearby hills, but few have been identified with certainty under the Vatican itself. A tempting clue comes from the area near the Vatican Library. During construction in the 19th century, workers discovered parts of mosaic floors, frescoes, and foundations that suggest a great Roman house of high standing. Who lived there? A senator? A general? A convert? Perhaps we will never know. The site was sealed and built over. In third place, the temples. Before Christianity, the Vatican Hill was home to several pagan cults. One of the most fascinating and least explored was the cult of the invincible sun promoted by Emperor Elagabalus in the 3rd century. Elagabalus, a teenager from Syria, tried to merge Roman and Oriental religions, building sanctuaries to the god of the sun on several Roman hills. Was one of them in the Vatican? Some sources suggest as such. The coins of his reign depict solar temples. Later, Christian writers mocked his attempts to merge the religions. However, conclusive remains of said sanctuary have not been found on the Vatican Hill. Has it disappeared, or is it hidden? Fourth, the hydraulic works. Ancient Rome was a city of aqueducts and sewers. The Vatican Hill, like the rest of Rome, would have been crossed by cisterns, wells, drainage systems, and pipes. It is possible that some of them are still preserved. During the construction of the Vatican's underground parking in the 20th century, builders found ancient drainage tunnels from the Roman era, lined with brick and still partially intact. They were diverted and, for the most part, were not documented. How many more exist? And are any of them connected with the first places of Christian baptism? Fifth, crypts and sealed chambers. This is the most speculative and exciting aspect. Multiple chapels, residences, and modern museums of the Vatican were built on unexplored substructures, foundations of unknown buildings, and vaults whose original purpose is unclear. Some may be from the late Roman era, and others earlier still. For example, in the grotto located under St. Peter, there are sealed doors, small openings walled up with bricks, and walls that lead to corridors that are no longer used. Who sealed them up? Why might they lead to forgotten tombs, to deposits of early Christian relics, or pagan shrines predating the tomb of Peter? The truth is, we just do not know. The Vatican does not publish complete maps of its underground architecture. What we have are fragments, sketches, notes from 20th century archaeologists. Many are incomplete, contradictory, or classified. And yet, the suspicion persists that under the Vatican, a deeper Vatican is hidden. Not a church, but ruins, not a basilica, but a puzzle. A Rome older than Peter, covered with bricks and silence. And some believe that the church prefers it to be that way, because what would happen if a pagan temple were found right under the altar of St. Peter? And what if it were discovered that the tomb of a Roman senator is only a few meters older than Peter's? And what if Christian tradition had to make room for something older, more complicated, more Roman? That is the tension hidden under the marble, not only between history and theology, but also between memory and oblivion. Because just as the Vatican has buried the structures of Rome under its foundations, it has also buried 1,000 questions. And yet, among those questions, a peculiar mystery shines like an ember. The strange cult, a forgotten emperor, and a sun god from the east. Let's look at Elagabalus and the god he tried to crown on the Vatican Hill. The Roman emperor, the cult of Elagabalus on the Vatican Hill. The Vatican Hill has always had a strange gravitational pull for the sacred and the profane. Long before it became the nerve center of world Catholicism, it was an intermediate place, a threshold between the city and the dead, between the empire and the marginalized, between official worship and clandestine faith. And in the 3rd century A.D.C., it became, for a brief and disturbing moment, the focal point of a god who was not Roman, local, or Christian. His name was Elagabalus, or, more precisely, that was the name given to both the god and the emperor who tried to impose him on Rome. Let's begin with the child himself. Elagabalus was born as Sextus Varius of Vitus Bassianus around the year 203 A.D.C. in Emesa, a Roman client kingdom in what is now Syria. His family was powerful, rich, and deeply intertwined with religious life. His mother and grandmother were high priestesses, and Elagabalus himself was consecrated hereditary high priest of the sun god Elagabal, or Elagabalus, the B.A. of Emesa. The cult was ancient and exotic by Roman standards. It focused on a black stone, possibly a meteorite, venerated as the physical embodiment of the god. The cult of Elagabalus included processions, blood sacrifices, ecstatic rituals, and a theology that merged solar veneration with divine royalty. When a child was 14 years old, political machinations, led largely by his mother Julia Suemias and his grandmother Julia Misa, placed him on the imperial throne after the assassination of the Emperor Caracalla and the brief, doomed reign of Macrinus. Thus, in the year 218 A.D.C., Rome gained not only a new emperor but also a new god. Because Elagabalus did not arrive in Rome alone. He brought his deity with him and intended to make him emperor as well. He ordered that the sacred stone of Elagabal be moved from Emesa to Rome in a lavish procession. The black stone was placed inside a golden chariot escorted by the emperor himself, who walked backwards before it as a sign of reverent submission. Upon arriving in Rome, the emperor immediately began to build a new temple, the Elagabalium, on the Palatine Hill. This was not merely a symbolic gesture. Elagabalus declared his god superior to all others, including Jupiter, the king of the Roman pantheon. He attempted to merge the cult of Elagabalus with traditional Roman religion by marrying the god to various Roman goddesses, including Astarte, Minerva, and eventually Vesta, the virgin goddess of the hearth. This was more than just heterodoxy. It was an imperial coup against theology, and it was not enough to build a temple on the Palatine. Elagabalus wanted a sacred network of sacred geography radiating from Rome with his god at its center. Which brings us to the Vatican Hill. Although no ancient source explicitly states that a temple of Elagabalus was built on the Vatican Hill, the circumstantial evidence is compelling. In first place, The zone was outside the pomerium, which made it legally available for foreign cults and imperial initiatives that could not accommodate the limits of the sacred city. In second place, the hill already housed a complex network of cult structures and entertainment. The circus of Narration, cemeteries, possible sanctuaries dedicated to Cybele and Mitra. It was a spiritually fertile, politically peripheral, and geographically significant place. In third place, the coins minted during Elagabalus's reign represent temples with architectural characteristics that do not coincide with the algabelium on the Palatine. Some scholars believe that these coins can make reference to auxiliary Ascitatella's temples built in zones like the Vatican to extend the reach of the cult. In fourth place, the later Christian tradition did everything possible to suppress any trace of the cult of Elagabalus. His name was condemned. His images were defaced. His temples were dismantled. His rituals were dissected in both Christian and pagan sources. Why such intensity? Because the cult seemed dangerous, not only theologically but symbolically too. Elagabalus not only introduced a new god, he tried to supplant the old ones. His rituals offended Roman sensibilities. He dressed in women's clothes. He referred to himself as both emperor and priest. He sought to dissolve the border between ruler and divine, between gender and role, between cult and government. For conservative Romans, it was obscene. For the first Christians, it was terrifyingly familiar because Elagabalus, in a perverse image in the mirror, had done what the church would soon try: to centralize a foreign god in Rome, to build new rituals, to dismantle the old pantheon, and to claim universal truth. And he almost got away with it. If Elagabalus had lived longer, if his theological imperialism had taken deeper root, the entire religious history of Rome could have taken an unrecognizable turn. But it was not to be. In the year 222 CE, after 4 years of chaos, scandals, and relentless sacrileges, Elagabalus was assassinated by his own guards. His body was mutilated, dragged through the streets, and thrown into the Tiber. His temple was desecrated. His cult was extinguished, or so the story goes, because the black stone of his god was discreetly returned to Emesa. And rumors persisted that the rituals, although underground, never completely disappeared. Some scholars believe that vestiges of Elagabalus's influence remained in the later solar cults of the Roman army. Others suggest that elements of his theology, monotheistic tendencies, solar imagery, and the figure of the divine king are found in the early Christian iconography of Constantine. And then there's the matter of the Vatican. If there was ever a sanctuary dedicated to Elagabalus there, it was probably small, perhaps an aedicule or a sacred platform for solar rites. It would have been dismantled, its stones reused, and its foundations buried under later Christian constructions. But archaeology has its own memory. During the 20th century excavations in the Vatican gardens, fragments of non-Christian iconography were discovered: solar rays, stylized eagles, serpentine motifs. They were dismissed as decorative or symbolic, but some have argued that they coincide with the aesthetics of the Eastern solar cult of the 3rd century. Is this proof? Is it suggestive? Deeply, and it leads to a chilling idea that before the cross of Peter rose on the Vatican Hill, there might have been a stone there, a black stone from the east, of a rival throne for a rival god. And if that stone was buried under the foundations of Constantine, if the temple was reduced to dust and poured into the new Christian basilica, the Vatican becomes not only a place of Christian triumph, but of sacrificial absorption. The substituted god, the forgotten emperor, the sealed memory. But memory has cracks, and as we detach the layers of belief, we discover questions older than the Church itself. Because, after all, the primitive Vatican was not only a Christian place. It was a palimpsest, and under the name of each saint, a Roman inscription. Under each martyr's tomb, some pagan foundations lie. And sometimes, under all that, just a chair, a seat, a relic, perhaps the oldest papal symbol of all. Let's examine the so-called chairs of St. Peter, the authenticity of St. Peter's chairs. In all the churches there is a seat that is not only for sitting, but has meaning representing the power and transmission of authority. In Latin, the word is cathedra, chair of the bishop. From this root comes the word cathedral, the church that houses the bishop's seat, the visible sign of his office and jurisdiction. And in Roma, there is a chair so venerable, so laden with history and mysticism, that its mere presence transcends furniture and becomes myth. The chair of St. Peter, or more precisely, the chairs of St. Peter, because there are not only one, but two, and both claim to be the seat of the apostle who, according to tradition, was the first bishop of Roma and whose spiritual authority has been repeated by all the popes since then. But are they real? Did Pedro the fisherman, the preacher, the man who walked on the waters and then denied Christo 3 times, ever sit on them? Let's unravel the mystery layer by layer. The most famous of these objects is the Cathedra Petri, consecrated in a spectacular Baroque style in the apse of the Basilica of San Pedro. Designed by John Lorenzo Bernini in the 17th century, this enormous bronze sculpture is a theatrical explosion of angels, clouds, and golden rays that culminates in a reliquary that houses an ancient wooden chair. That chair, according to the Church, is the relic known as the throne of St. Peter. But here is where the story fractures. The wooden chair inside the reliquary is rarely seen. For centuries, it was hidden, venerated, but unexamined. When it was finally studied during a restoration in 1867, it was revealed to be a highly modified piece of carpentry, assembled from various types of wood reinforced over the centuries, with carved ivory plates and inscriptions from different eras. The oldest parts of the chair may date from the 6th or 7th century. It is not the first, it is not from the time of Pedro. That is a problem. If this is the chair that Pedro used to teach, bless, and govern, why does it only appear in historical records centuries after his death? And what about the second chair? Less famous, but perhaps more mysterious. The second chair of St. Peter is an artifact that is found in the Basilica of San Giovanni in Laterano, the Archbasilica of San Pedro. Juan de Latran, the current cathedral of the Bishop of Roma and former papal residence for more than a millennium. This chair has also been venerated as a relic of Pedro. It is simpler, less ornate, and of even more ambiguous origin. Both chairs have been associated with Pedro since at least the High Middle Ages. Their status as relics is attested by ecclesiastical documents, liturgical texts, and the fact that both were the center of religious festivals. The most notable is the Feast of the Chair of St. Peter, which is still celebrated on February 22nd. But what do we really know about their origins? Very little. There are no references to Pedro's chair in the writings of the 1st or 2nd century. The Acts of Pedro, an apocryphal text, include long speeches, but do not mention that he sat in a special seat. The letters of the Fathers of the Church Clementi, Ignacio, and Ireneo speak of the authority of Pedro, but not of his furniture. The symbolism of the chair emerges slowly around the 4th century, when the papacy begins to consolidate its institutional identity. In this period, the chair of Pedro becomes a metaphor. Sitting in the chair of Pedro is to inherit his authority. But metaphors tend to materialize. In the 5th and 6th centuries, church leaders began to refer to a real object that, it was said, was kept in Roma, was used in liturgies, and was associated with the first bishops. Was it from Pedro? Was it from a later bishop? And was it retroactively assigned to the apostle? It is not clear. But as the power of the church grew, so did the need for relics. The beginning of the Middle Ages witnessed a boom in the collection, authentication, and veneration of sacred objects, bones of saints, nails of the cross, fragments of the true cross, and chairs. Relics not only inspired faith, but grounded power. Owning the chair of Pedro was to claim the uninterrupted line of apostolic succession. It turned the papacy not only into a theological office, but into a throne rooted in tangible history. Thus the relics arose, carefully preserved, occasionally exhibited, venerated in processions and festivals, and finally enclosed in bronze by Bernini, transformed into an icon so immense and dramatic that its humble original form almost disappeared from view. But the question remains, could the original chair of Pedro have survived from the 1st century? It is unlikely. What decomposes? Roma burned many times. The first Christians did not have a custom of preserving furniture. They fled, they hid, they died, and Pedro himself was a fugitive, a man in constant movement, preaching in clandestine churches, baptizing in catacombs, facing crucifixion in a circus. Did he even own a chair? Perhaps a stool? Perhaps a borrowed bench? Perhaps nothing. The idea of a fixed throne for Pedro only makes sense once Christianity becomes institutionalized, when the bishop becomes a bureaucrat and the church becomes a building. Even so, the relics endure. And this is where the story gets strange, because the chairs, whether authentic or symbolic, contain clues. Inscriptions in Latin and Greek, carvings of animals and foliage, traces of Oriental influence. Some scholars believe that the ivory plates of the Petri Cathedral reflect Syrian Christian iconography, suggesting that it may have been assembled or, at least, decorated by Oriental artisans. Could it have been brought to Roma by a bishop from Antioquia? Could it be a synthesis of traditions, a chair made not for Pedro, but in his name, an object that absorbed his memory instead of carrying his footprint? It is possible, but that's not the same. Because however old the wood may be, however intricate the carving may be, the essence of Pedro's authority was never posture. It was presence. The true chair of Pedro was the community that gathered around him. The believers who listened to his words, who carried his letters, who buried his body and built a church upon his bones. The scope of the Roman persecution on the Vatican Hill. To walk through the Vaticano today is to enter a sanctified city of light, order, and ritual. Tourists crowd the square. Pilgrims kneel before altars. The great dome of Miguel Ángel floats above our heads like a sun of stone. It is a place of certainty. But under that certainty hides a question older than the marble, deeper than the catacombs, written not with gold, but with blood. How many Christians died here? What was the true scope of the Roman persecution on the Vatican Hill? The official version is well known. Nero, in his frantic need to find scapegoats after the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64 D.C., directed his anger against the Christians. He executed them with theatrical cruelty, crucifixions, burnings, wild beasts, and he did it in a place now covered by the grandeur of the Basilica of San Pedro. Among the dead, according to tradition, was Pedro himself, crucified upside down in the circus of Narration and buried nearby, on the Vatican Hill. It is a story engraved in the Catholic conscience. It is taught to children in school and commemorated in the liturgy. But, as always, the devil lies in the details. Because although the martyrdom of Pedro is widely accepted, although it is not archaeologically proven in an indisputable way, the magnitude of the persecution that took place here on the Vatican Hill remains one of the great unquantified enigmas of the history of the early church. Let's begin with the sources. The most detailed account of the time comes from Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian, who wrote at the beginning of the 2nd century, approximately 50 years after the events he describes. In his Annals, 1544, Tacitus recounts how Narration blamed the Christians for the fire and punished them with exquisite cruelty. Covered with animal skins, they were torn apart by dogs and perished, or they were nailed to crosses or condemned to the flames and burned. He goes on to describe how these executions took place during the festivities in the gardens of Narration, turning his private estate, which is believed to have included the area of the Vatican Hill, into a blood-soaked arena. But Tacitus is imprecise regarding the numbers. He does not give names. He does not offer a precise location or list of victims. His account is valuable, but it is a literary source elaborated with moral purposes, not forensic clarity. Other sources are even scarcer. Suetonio mentions that Narration punished the Christians, but not in context of the fire. Cassio writes about the persecution of the Christians in more general terms, but he does not give details about the Vatican Hill. In summary, the literary records confirm that the Christians were murdered under Narration and probably on the Vatican Hill, but they leave open the interpretation of the magnitude of events. So what do the archaeological records tell us? This is where things get complicated. The Vatican necropolis, partly excavated during the 19th century, contains dozens of tombs, mausoleums, and funerary niches dating from the 1st to the 3rd centuries. Some of these tombs show Christian symbols. A few contain inscriptions that mention martyrdom, but the great majority are anonymous. There are no names, nor causes of death, nor smoking pyres. There is no common grave of martyrs under the basilica. At least, none has yet been found. However, the tradition of the massive martyrdom on the Vatican Hill persisted and intensified over time. The first Christian writers, like Ushio, Lactancio, and Geronimo, embellished the narration. Later, the hagiographies added names, miracles, and backgrounds to the anonymous dead. In the 4th century, the martyrologies assigned saints to specific places on the hill without archaeological basis. It was not necessarily an invention. It was the memory distorted by the persecution, molded by the devotion, and repeated by the liturgy. But some modern historians now ask themselves, was the magnitude of the martyrdom on the Vatican Hill exaggerated? Perhaps. However, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We must remember what the executions were. Extrajudicial murders, public spectacles, precipitate acts carried out during a binge driven by an emperor's anger. It is possible that the bodies were not buried at all. They could have been burned, thrown into the Tiber, or shattered by animals until unrecognizable. And if some were buried on the hill, they could lie in unidentified tombs that were later reused or destroyed by centuries of construction. Even more disturbing, it is possible that some common graves remain undiscovered. Some parts of the Vatican Hill remain unexcavated due to logistical and political limitations, like the zones situated under the Apostolic Palace, the southern extensions of the necropolis, and some sections of the Vatican Gardens. What could be under those sealed layers? Bones, lime pits, execution posts, or simply silence. And then there is the broader chronology. The persecution of Neron was the first, but not last. During the following 250 years, the Christians of Roma faced repeated waves of state violence under Duzius Valerian Diocletian. During these periods, bishops were executed, churches were destroyed, properties were confiscated, and Roma, as the capital, suffered its share of martyrdom. But was the Vatican Hill used in these later persecutions? Possibly. There is some evidence that the zone conserved its symbolic significance. Even after the circus of Neron fell into disuse, the hill continued to be a place of memory. The pilgrims began to gather near the supposed tomb of Pedro. The presence of multiple Christian tombs in the zone suggests that the faithful wanted to be buried near their spiritual patriarch. And not only Christians. The necropolis contains tombs with ambiguous symbolism that mixes pagan and Christian motifs. This suggests a fluid and superimposed spiritual landscape in which persecution was not always clear. It is possible that some Christians lived publicly without suffering much harassment. Others may have died, not for their faith, but during periods of generalized civil unrest. So, how many Christians died on a Vatican Hill? Dozens? Hundreds? Thousands? The answer is we don't know, but ambiguity could be key, because persecution isn't always about numbers. It's about fear, the threat of death, the knowledge that beliefs can cost your life, that defined the psyche of the early church. The Vatican Hill was not just a place of blood. It was a place of pressure, the pressure of silence, the pressure of faith, the pressure of memory that hardened, until it became myth. And that pressure endures each time a pope appears before St. Peter's tomb. Every time Mass is celebrated over the confessionals, the Church relives that tension. Glory built upon pain. Victory built upon disappearance. And perhaps the greatest martyrdom was anonymity. Because for every Peter whose name is engraved in gold, hundreds are buried in silence. And just as we wonder about their deaths, we must wonder about the life around them. What do these Christians write? What language do they speak? How did they record their pain? Before Latin hymns and Gregorian chants, before the Bible was fixed, there were the letters. But in what language? Let's decipher the Vatican's first documents and the languages in which they survived. The language and writing in the Vatican's first documents. Before the Vatican was a city, sanctuary, or factory of doctrine, it was something simpler, more hidden. It was a struggling community, persecuted, deeply literate in spirit and ink. They did not have basilicas, but they had something more dangerous. They wrote, and what they wrote. The first documents of the Vatican, the first spiritual communications of the Church of Rome, would shake the world. But what language did they use? What tools? What alphabets? And most urgent of all, where are those documents now? Let's start with the heart of it. What was the first language of the Roman Church? The instinctive answer is Latin. The Vatican is in Rome. After all, the Roman Empire spoke Latin. The Mass in Latin would define Western Christianity for over 1,500 years. Therefore, it's natural to think Latin must have been the initial language. But the story isn't that simple. During the first 2 centuries of Christianity in Rome, the main language of worship, scripture, and theological debate was Greek. Yes, Greek, the language of Homer and Herodotus, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, the language spoken by the apostles, by the first evangelists, and by most people who lived in the slums and multicultural markets of first-century Rome. Why? Because the early Roman Church wasn't born of senators and patricians. It was made up of slaves, freedmen, and immigrants. The Christian population of Rome was disproportionately Eastern in origin. Jews from Judea, merchants from Asia Minor, refugees from Antioch and Alexandria. They brought their faith in Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek, the common dialect of the ancient world. Even Paul, the most Roman of the apostles, wrote to Romans in Greek. And even in Roma, Greek remained the dominant ecclesiastical language for at least the first 2 centuries. The first Christian texts, letters, homilies, and confessions of faith circulated in Greek. What does this mean for the earliest documents of the Vaticano? It means that they probably were not written in Latin. Let's see some candidates. First, the letters of Clement I, Bishop of Roma, written around the year 96 AD. The Epistle of Clement to the Corinthians is among the first Christian writings outside the New Testament. It was composed in Greek and speaks with the voice of Roman authority that intervenes in a theological dispute in Corinto, affirming the primacy of the Roman Church. It is the first time that Roma addresses the Church in general and does so in Greek. Secondly, the Shepherd of Hermas, a strange and mystical Christian text written at the beginning of the 2nd century, possibly in Roma. It was immensely popular in the early Christian communities, and some even considered it sacred scripture. It is written in Greek. Third, the fragments of the writings of Ignacio, Polycarpo, and other subapostolic fathers that Saulo composed or received in Roma, all in Greek. Fourth, the liturgical inscriptions found in the Roman catacombs, acclamations, abbreviations, are frequently in Greek, especially from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Cairo, the Ichkeys, the word agape, all engraved in Greek letters on the walls of the earth. So, when does Latin enter the scene? Little by little. And then, suddenly, in the mid to late 2nd century, Latin begins to appear in Roman Christian writings, not as a substitute for Greek, but as a complement. The Roman Church, increasingly centralized and administrative, begins speaking in the language of the empire. Christian texts begin appearing in Latin. The Octavio of Minutio Felix, the translation into Latin of Against the Heresies of Ireneo, the first Roman canons, and baptismal formulas. In the 3rd century, the change accelerates. The Acts of the Martyrs Perpetua and Felicidad, written in a mixture of Latin narrative and Greek-style diary entries, reflect the hybrid nature of Christian linguistic identity in the empire. The Bishop of Carthago, Cipriano, writes prolifically in Latin. The Roman Church begins translating the scriptures, giving rise to the Vitus Latina, the ancient Latin Bible, precursor to the Vulgata of Geronimo. However, even in the 3rd century, Greek remains dominant in theological discourse. The Roman popes themselves, Calixtus, Cornelius, and Lucius, continue to issue correspondence in Greek, which leads us to a huge question. Were those letters? Were the first archives of the Vaticano? Because we know they existed. The Church was bureaucratic from its beginning. Even under persecution, It kept records, lists of baptisms, calendars of martyrs, letters from bishops, instructions for worship. They were not ephemeral. They were sacred texts. And when the church came out of the shadows in the 4th century, it began to build a real archive. But the oldest materials from the 1st to 3rd centuries disappeared, were lost, or hidden. Some were destroyed during the persecution of Diocletian between 303 and 311 AD, when churches were razed and the scriptures were burned. Others were simply not preserved. The papyrus disintegrates. Time erases. Fire consumes. But still, rumors persist that in the depths of the Apostolic Archive of the Vaticano, formerly the Secret Archive, there are untranslated Greek scrolls, fragments of early papal correspondence, drafts of creeds and condemnations. That somewhere in those 80 kilometers of shelves there is a letter from Clementi not addressed to Corinto, but to Jerusalem, or a baptismal record from the year 70 AD, written in Greek and preserved on wax tablets, in which the first converts baptized in the shadow of the Circus of Nero are named. Proofs? We do not have them, but we do have precedents. We know that the Vatican has unearthed forgotten texts, letters from popes never published before. We know that the archive contains documents from the 9th and 10th centuries that were only discovered in the 21st century. And we know that most of the archive has never been digitized or fully cataloged. So, what does this mean for the language of? What does this mean for the language of the oldest Vatican? It means that the Church was born multilingual. Greek in the scriptures, Latin in the government, Aramaic in memory, perhaps even Hebrew for those who preserve the oldest Judeo-Christian traditions. It means that the first pope, if that title can be applied to him, probably prayed in Greek, taught in Aramaic, and died under a Latin inscription he could not read. And it means that the first documents of the Vatican, if they still exist, may not be what we expect. They may not be grandiose encyclicals. They may not carry seals or signatures. They may be fragments, notes, corrections. To introduce contraband bread into the Mamertine prison, a list of names that was read in a secret Eucharist, a confession carved in wood. But even when we pursue language, we come across even older enigmas. Because before Latin Rome was Christian, it was something else. And so was the Vatican Hill. Before Pedro, before Pablo, before the catacombs and the crosses, there was a name, a word, Vaticanis. But where did it come from? Let's go back further than ever and discover the pagan roots of the hill itself. The origin of the name of the Vatican Hill. Before it was a throne. Before it was a hill crowned by saints and domes. Before the bones of Pedro were buried, unearthed, and buried again under layers of faith and empire. It was something completely different. It was a word, Vaticanis, and its origins remain one of the oldest, most murky and disturbing mysteries that lie beneath the Church. The modern Vatican Hill is synonymous with Catholicism, is Holy Land, spiritual capital, and an eternal archive. But the name of the hill predates Christianity. It predates Rome. It even predates the Latin language itself. The word Vaticanis is older than Christ, older than Caesar, older than the city that made them both famous. So what does it mean? Let's delve deeper. The first references to the word Vaticanis appear in pre-Christian Latin literature, but point to an even deeper linguistic root that goes back to the Etruscans, the enigmatic civilization that ruled central Italy before. The Etruscans were masters of divination. They believed that the future could be read in the flight of birds, in the tracks of animals, and in the cracks of lightning. They built temples aligned with the stars, interpreted the signs in silence and fire, and transmitted their prophetic traditions to the Romans. And that is where Vaticanis comes into the scene. The name of the hill may derive from the Latin word vates, which means seer or prophet. This root has given us words like vaticona, a poetic term for prophecy, and even Vaticano, in its original etymological sense, may simply mean place of seers. That is a poetic theory, but perhaps not enough. Some linguists believe that Vaticanis could be the Latinization of an ancient Etruscan toponym lost to time. The hill may have been a sacred place long before the Romans built their tombs and circuses there. a place used for omens and ceremonies intended to reveal the will of the gods. In Roman mythology, the hill was associated with an obscure deity called Vaticanis or Vagitanusa, god of speech. Sometimes it was said that he presided over the first cries of newborns. According to ancient sources, such as Varro, Vaticanis was the divine figure who opened babies' mouths and let them cry at birth. Let us reflect on this. The Vatican, the hill of first cries, the place where voices began. From this perspective, the modern role of the Vatican as world spokesperson of doctrine, proclamation, and moral pronouncement seems chillingly predestined, as if the earth itself were destined to speak. But not everyone agrees with this derivation. Some argue that the name Vaticanis did not refer to the hill itself, but to a region of Vaticana, a swampy and fertile area on the western bank of the Tiber, outside the original Pomerium. Being outside the city limits, this area was often used for burials, gardens, and agricultural estates. It was an unclaimed space between the living and dead, which fits again, since the Vatican Hill has always been a liminal place, a border between Rome and what is not Rome, between the emperor and the bishop, between the pagan and the Christian, between the tomb and the altar. So, whether the name referred to a god, a seer, a geographical oddity, or all of the above, it tells us something essential. This was always a place with meaning, even before Peter, even before Nero, even before Latin. And we have archaeological indications to support it. Fragments of early Italic and Etruscan ceramics have been found on the hill. The pre-Roman foundations, now buried under Christian structures, show evidence of stone channels for ritual use, burnt offerings, outdoor altars, the kind of activity that does not build cities but blesses them. In the minds of the ancient Romans, the Vatican Hill was spiritually potent but ritually outside. It was not within the sacred walls of Rome. That meant it was available for experimentation with foreign gods, both impure and divine. And the Romans took full advantage of it. As the empire expanded, so did its religious imports. Cults from the East, from Africa, and from the depths of the provinces found a home on the margins of the city. The Vatican became a spiritual refugee camp that welcomed deities that did not quite fit into Jupiter's court. Cybele, Isis, Mithras, and Heliogabalus. These gods and the rituals associated with them left faint traces. Foundations of temples, statues, inscriptions. Most were destroyed, reused, or replaced by later constructions. Some may still lie beneath the gardens, the museums, the apostolic palace, sealed not by intention, but by centuries of geological layers. And the very name of the Vatican remains the only linguistic survivor of that world. A fossil word, a whisper of an era in which the hill did not resonate with bells or choirs, but with the cries of children and the murmurs of prophets. What would those prophets have said if they had seen what the hill would become? If they had seen basilicas built where there used to be tombs? If they had seen an empire of faith built on an empire of bones? Perhaps they would have nodded their heads, because prophecy is not prediction. It is recognition. And the Vatican has always recognized its own power. It buried the ancient gods, but never forgot them. It silenced the seers, but kept their name. It paved over the omens, but inherited its gaze. And even today, in the most remote corners of its library, the Church keeps records not only of saints, but also of signs, visions, and conversions. Because the power of the Vatican does not reside only in the authority it exercises, but in the secrets it keeps. And one of the biggest secrets is exactly how it convinced the most elitist class in Rome, the senators, the patricians, the highborn pagans, to abandon their gods and convert. Let's enter that shadowy corridor. Let us follow the traces of the secret conversion of Rome's ruling class. The conversion of the senators and Roman elites to Christianity. Christianity began in alleys, in rented rooms and borrowed courtyards, in underground tombs, in slave quarters, in markets that smelled of fish and sweat, and where rumors were whispered. It was a religion of the poor, the marginalized, the anonymous. Its first believers were not patricians or senators, but fishermen, weavers, women, and fugitives. And yet, At the beginning of the 4th century, something extraordinary happened. The elites, the ruling class of Rome, the very architects of pagan civilization, began to convert. Not in mass baptisms, nor in grandiose public gestures, but in secret, one by one, in silence, deliberately, and strategically. And when Constantine legalized the church, the Christian faith had already settled in the very heart of Roman power. How? This is the oldest political mystery in the Vatican. How did Christianity penetrate palaces before it conquered the streets? Let's reconstruct these shadows. To understand the mechanics of the conversion of the elite, we must start from the Roman class structure. Senators, equestrians, senior officials, landowners, military elite. These were the men and few influential women who controlled the empire. They were deeply rooted in Rome's pagan traditions. They presided at religious festivals. They financed temples. They were priests of the official cults. However, the first cracks began to appear. The crisis of the 3rd century, military disasters, plagues, inflation, civil war. The myth of eternal Rome. The ancient gods stopped fulfilling promises. Jupiter kept silent. The oracles failed. People began looking elsewhere. Christianity, with its message of resurrection, resistance, and final justice, began to whisper in those cracks. At first, it was a dangerous and illegal curiosity. But curiosity is a powerful contagion. And in the sprawling city of Rome, where slaves, servants, and clients moved through the houses of the elite like blood through veins, that curiosity had a carrier. The slaves. Many Romans in the elite owned Christian slaves. These Christians brought their faith to the houses not by force, but through constancy, suffering, resistance, and the power of prayer spoken behind closed doors. And over time, some masters began to listen. We have scattered evidence, letters, inscriptions, private diaries. In the catacombs of Priscilla, one of Rome's oldest Christian cemeteries, we find tombs of the elite with high-quality frescoes, marble carvings, and inscriptions in refined Greek and Latin. These were not poor believers, but members of the Roman upper class. Women named Julia, men named Marcus, buried under symbols of Christian hope. In the Acts of the Christian martyrs, sometimes embellished, sometimes exaggerated, we find references to senior officials who welcomed Christians, offered them refuge during persecutions, and secretly converted before being discovered and executed. There's the case of Fabius Clemens, a consul under the Emperor Domitian, executed in the year 95 AD, supposedly for atheism, a Roman euphemism often used to refer to Christians who refused to worship the gods. Or the martyrdom of Apollonius, a Roman senator tried and executed around the year 185 AD for openly professing his Christianity. Or the enigmatic inscriptions near Latran, which speak of senators in Christ with ambiguous phrases, perhaps rhetorical, perhaps literal. But the most significant trail of clues leads not to tombs or texts, but to networks. Because the conversion of Roman elite did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred through relationships, family ties, marriages, chains of patronage. The early Roman Church was a network of domus ecclesiae homes where believers gathered in private homes to worship, eat, baptize, and remember the dead. Many of these houses were owned or frequented by members of the equestrian or senatorial classes. We know of at least a dozen titular churches in Rome that are named after people like Priscilla, Pudin, Clementi, or Cecilia, who are believed to have been real hosts, real owners, real believers from the aristocracy. These names were not chosen randomly. They were signs that Christianity had entered the halls, that it had begun whispering on the marble floors. And this is where the story takes a turn. As many of these elite conversions were never publicly recorded, there was no incentive. Christianity remained illegal until the year 313 AD. Professing faith could mean exile, loss of property, or execution. So the converts remained hidden, baptized in private communion under the protection of night. And when they died, they were buried in Christian tombs, but often without obvious symbols, only names, dates, a subtle fish engraved on the stone, a discreet cross carved in the lower part of sarcophagus lid. The Vatican necropolis contains some of these tombs. They are not marked by martyrdom. They are marked by money. Marble, mosaics, inscriptions in Latin, all with indications of Christian belief, not declarations, just indications. Because these were people who navigated between two worlds, pagans in public, Christians in secret, priests of Jupiter by day, followers of Christ at night. And over time, this tension shifted the balance of power. By the beginning of the 4th century, an inflection point had been reached. When Constantino marched on Roma in 312 DC, many members of the senatorial class supported him silently, not because they believed in his vision, which he had not yet revealed, but because they saw in him a new order, new legitimacy. And when Constantino promulgated the Edict of Milan in 313, those secret believers came to light. The senators financed basilicas. Elite families donated lands. The former persecutors became patrons. The Palace of Latran, ceded to the church by Constantino, was located on land already owned by Christian nobles. And once Christianity was legalized, the transformation was rapid. At the end of the 4th century, under Theodosio I, Christianity became the empire's official religion. The pagan temples closed. The idols were destroyed. The Senate itself, which had been the guardian of Roma's ancestral gods, bowed before the Bishop of Roma. But the foundations had been laid in darkness, in whispered prayers, in secret baptisms, in dinners where scriptures were passed between glasses of wine. The conversion of the elite was no miracle. It was a strategy, perhaps the oldest and most effective that the church has used. But this raises a deeper question. If the elite converted secretly, who negotiated that change? Who bridged the gap between a persecuted sect and imperial favor? Who did politics in shadows? Because Christianity did not become the religion of Roma by chance. It did so through a missing link. A series of conversations, favors, promises, and unknown conversions lost in time. Let's follow that missing link. The secret evolution from forbidden faith to state religion. The missing link between early Christianity and imperial patronage. Something happened in the dark. Somewhere between the catacombs and the palace, between the blood of the martyrs and the ink of the imperial edicts, between the secret meetings and the triumphal basilicas, there is a gap, an abyss of silence veiled by incense and marble that historians still cannot fully explain. How did Christianity go from persecuted faith to the official religion of the state? Who negotiated that peace? Who whispered in the emperor's ear? Who signed the church's name on the dotted line of the empire? This is the missing link in Vatican history. And it's not just about Constantino. It's about what happened before him, around him, and below him. Because although the Edict of Milan of 313 AD is often described as a sudden ray of tolerance, a radical shift from persecution to protection, the reality is more complex. The alliance between the church and the empire did not begin on a battlefield or in council. It began in silence, with agreements, marriages, unregistered baptisms, in a change so subtle and lasting that it left almost no traces, only consequences. Let's go back. At the end of the 3rd century, Christianity was no longer a marginal sect. Despite waves of persecution under Duzius II, 491, Valerian 257-260, and Diocletian 30-31, the faith had spread through all social levels. There were Christian soldiers, merchants, scribes, physicians, and, yes, members of the imperial house. How do we know this? Because we have records of Christians in the emperor's court before Constantine. An example, Dorotheus and Gorgonius, chamberlains of Diocletiano, were executed for refusing to renounce their faith. They were senior palace officials, trusted close. Their deaths were not isolated. They were part of a purge, which means there were others. Others who were not captured, others who remained silent. This is the beginning of a missing link. Christians in power before the church had power. Let's add another layer. It is rumored, according to the Christian Sorcesto, that the Empress Priza, wife of Diocletiano, was secretly Christian or at least sympathetic. Her daughter Valeria is also implicated. It is true, perhaps, but even the rumors suggest proximity. Now let's add Constancio Chlorus, Constantine's father. Constancio ruled as Caesar in the West, including Gaul and Great Britain. Although he was technically under the edict of Diocletian to persecute Christians, it is said that he did so with moderation. Eusebius claims that he refused to destroy churches or execute believers. Once again, historically confusing, but thematically coherent. When Constantine came to power in the year 306, de-Christianity was already rooted. It was no longer a virus. It was a silent co-author of power, which brings us to the inflection point. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge in the year 312 A.D.C. According to legend, Constantine, facing the forces of Magencio on the outskirts of Rome, had a vision of a cross in the sky and heard a voice saying, "In this sign you will conquer." He ordered his men to paint Christian symbols on their shields. He won the battle. He entered Rome triumphantly. But here's the twist. Contemporary sources, such as the panegyrics delivered in his honor immediately afterwards, do not mention the vision. Uxius, the bishop who would later write Constantine's semi-official biography, does not record the miracle until years later, after Constantine had fully converted to Christianity. So what really happened? Possibility 1. Constantine truly converted on the eve of the battle, a sincere religious awakening. Possibility 2. Constantine was already a sympathizer, perhaps even a Christian in private, and seized the moment to reveal his alignment. Possibility 3. It was a calculated political maneuver designed to co-opt the growing Christian population and legitimize his claim to the throne through divine sanction. All are plausible, but not demonstrable. But, again, the miracle is not that Constantine became a Christian. It is that the church was prepared for him. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity, the Roman Church moved with astonishing speed. Within months, Constantine issued edicts returning confiscated property to Christians. He first financed the Basilica of San Basilio in Latran and then that of San Pedro. He convened councils. He exempted the clergy from paying taxes. He maintained personal correspondence with the bishops. This is not the behavior of a man who embraces a marginal group. It is the behavior of someone fulfilling an agreement. And that agreement, whatever its form, was the missing link. A pact between the church and Caesar. But who negotiated it? No name is preserved. There is no Cardinal Richelieu. There is no Nicodemus behind the curtain. Instead, there are traces, bishops like Milesiades and Sylvestra, who suddenly rose to prominence. Letters between the imperial offices and Christian leaders, patronages, protection, and soft power. And then there is Helena, mother of Constantine, later canonized as Saint Helena. It is said that she converted before her son, possibly during her marriage to Constantius. She was pious, curious, and very influential. Her pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the 320s resulted in the discovery of the true cross, the foundation of important basilicas, and the elevation of Christian relics to imperial status. She was not only the mother of Constantine, she was Christianity's mother-in-law in the empire. But Helena did not act alone. Behind her was a growing group of Christian administrators, scholars, and financiers, such as Lactantius, a former pagan rhetorician converted to Christianity who was teacher of Constantine's son, or Eushio, whose access to imperial circles shaped the theological narrative for generations. They were not behind-the-scenes negotiators. They were theological strategists. They helped frame Christianity not as a break with Roma, but as its true heir. The gods had failed. Christ had prevailed. The empire would remain alive in marble and legions, but in spirit and creed, and Constantine accepted it, although not immediately. His path to baptism was slow, ambiguous, and politically cautious. He was not baptized until his deathbed in the year 337 AC. Until then, he followed a line building churches while continuing to invoke the sun god on coins, protecting bishops, and retaining the title of Pontifex Maximus. But the handshake had already occurred. The missing link had fallen into place. And once it did, the Vaticano was born not as a building, but as an association, an empire, an altar, a throne, and a cross. Roma was not defeated by Christianity, but baptized by it. And yet, not everything old was swept away. Some temples remained, some shrines were reconverted, some altars simply buried. Which brings us to the next mystery. What happened to the pagan temples that once stood on the Vaticano Hill itself? Were they demolished? Were they still there, sleeping under the saints? Let's exhume the ruins of the forgotten gods, the fate of the pagan temples on or near the Vaticano Hill. Before the basilicas, there were altars. Before the popes, there were priests dressed in purple. Before the crosses, before the saints, before Peter and Paul had their names engraved in marble and in legend, there were other gods on the Vaticano Hill. Gods who walked in the shadows, gods who stood in stone, gods who demanded blood and incense long before any censer moved inside a church. And the question that remained unanswered, like a cracked inscription on a ruined temple: what happened to them? What became of the pagan temples that once stood on or near the Vaticano Hill? Were they destroyed in a fire of Christian triumph? Converted into churches, rebuilt, forgotten, erased? Or are they still there? Buried underground, foundations under foundations, ghosts under saints. To answer this, we have to go back not to Peter, nor to Constantine, but to before both, to the pre-Christian topography of the western bank of Roma. The Vaticano Hill, or Mons Vaticanus, was not considered sacred in the traditional Roman sense. It was located outside the Pomerium, the religious boundary of the city, and was therefore a kind of liminal space, a buffer zone between Roma proper and the wild lands that stretched beyond. But that does not mean that it was spiritually barren. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Precisely because of its location outside the legal city, it became a refuge for foreign cults, mysterious religions, literary rituals, and experimental theology. They were beliefs that did not quite fit into the orderly pantheon of Jupiter, Marte, and Minerva. Beliefs that came from Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and Persia. Beliefs that promised rebirth, transcendence, secret knowledge, and had temples. Not always grandiose, not always sanctioned, but real. Let's start with what we know. We know that the Ager Vaticanist, the plain at the foot of the hill, was dotted with villas and gardens during the last stage of the Republic and the first years of the Empire. The rich Romans built their houses there, with private sanctuaries and ritual spaces. Several funerary inscriptions and artifacts from the area mention Oriental deities such as Sibyl, the Great Mother, Isis, and Mitra. In fact, we have direct archaeological evidence of an underground temple dedicated to Mitra, the Mitrium, discovered near the Vatican in the 1930s during the construction of a garage under the Via della Conciliation. The structure had an altar, benches for ritual banquets, and the iconic Terrakin Mithras killing the cosmic bull. That temple was sealed and covered, a footnote in the expansion of Christian Rome. But how many others were lost? What about the cult of Cybele? Cybele, the mother of the gods, arrived in Roma in 204 A.C. from Phrygia in Asia Minor. Her rites were intense and were characterized by ecstatic music, castration, and blood sacrifices. Although her main temple was on the Palatino, sanctuaries dedicated to her and her consort, Attis, sprang up throughout the city. Inscriptions found on the Vatican Hill refer to the devotees of Cybele and the priests known as Galician assistants of the goddess. Were there temples here? Probably. Were they razed? Perhaps. Were they absorbed by the Christian sites? It is very likely. The early church was expert at changing names. Where pagan temples once stood, churches were built, not always to erase the past, but to appropriate its power, to say that this sacred place is now ours. A compelling theory suggests that the Basilica of Santa Maria in Trastevere, across the river from the Vatican Hill, was built on an ancient shrine dedicated to Cybele. If true, the logic is eerily poetic. The pagan mother replaced by the Virgin Maria, but the most difficult possibility to imagine remains a temple dedicated to the sun. Before his total conversion, Constantino favored the cult of Sol and Victusi, the unconquerable sun. This deity, was a mixture of previous solar gods, including the Oriental Eligab and the Roman Apollo. Sol was celebrated on December 25th. He was considered a divine ruler, the light of the empire. Some scholars believe that Constantino, before Christianizing the Vatican Hill, had a solar sanctuary there, perhaps a temple, perhaps a monumental altar. Others argue that it may have been the work of Elagabalus, who attempted to establish Alma as the supreme deity of Roma. No definitive ruins of an Alma temple have been found on the hill, but the circumstantial clues are hard to ignore. First, the obelisk. The obelisk that now stands in the center of San Pedro Square originally stood in the center of Narration Circus. It is of Egyptian origin, imported by Caligula, and originally associated with the sun god Ra. In Roman use, obelisks used to mark solar shrines could have been at the heart of a shrine dedicated to Alma. Secondly, the axis of the original San Pedro Basilica. Constantino's builders oriented the basilica in such a way that it could be aligned with previous pagan monuments. Some argue that the orientation suggests a deliberate alignment with the solar equinoxes, which stripped the souls, echoing the cult of souls. Third, the silence. The suspicious silence. Rome was meticulous about its records. The temples were documented, the dedications inscribed, the restorations noted. And yet, regarding the Vatican Hill, we have almost nothing about pre-Christian structures, only scattered inscriptions on tombs and suggestive artifacts. Could the church have erased what was there before? Or did it preserve it brick by brick within its foundations? In the 1940s, during the excavations of the Vatican necropolis, archaeologists discovered a room of strange structure under the walls of the basilica that did not align with the architecture of the Roman tombs. No one could conclusively identify it. It was sealed, cataloged, and labeled unfinished. What if it was part of a temple? A vestige of a cult erased, not only by time, but theology. Because, let's not be mistaken, the church inherited more than the power of Rome. It inherited its real estate, and like any new owner, made changes. But, unlike other transformations of Rome, which turned forums into rubble and temples into museums, the Vatican buried its past under holiness. Eternity is not achieved by showing scaffolding. And yet, in silence, the stones speak. The ground under the Basilica of St. Peter is geologically unstable, but spiritually it is full of contradictions, a place of tombs and temples of saints and solar gods of sacrifice and ceremony. The Vatican wasn't built on virgin land. It was built. Peter is unstable from a geological point of view, but spiritually it is full of contradictions. It is a place of tombs and temples of saints and solar gods of sacrifices and ceremonies. The Vatican wasn't built on virgin land. It was built on a battlefield and won. But just before the basilicas took control, before the sanctuary of Peter became the gravitational center of Christian Rome, there were still houses, private homes where believers met in secret, the Domus Ecclesiae. Most of them lost, most unmarked. But maybe if we listen carefully, we can still hear prayers rising from its walls. Let's find them. The exact location and size of the first two Christian Domus Ecclesiae in Rome. Before the sound of choirs filled the domes, before the bishops stood on golden altars, before the Eucharist rose in golden chalices under stained glass and the roar of organs. It all started around tables, in kitchens, in courtyards, in borrowed houses and rooms that smelled of bread, olive oil, and fear. The Domus Ecclesiae, literally church houses, were at the heart of early Christian life. They were not churches as we think of them today. They were private residences that also served as sacred spaces. Secular by law, sacred by use, camouflaged, resistant, indefinable, and now, for the most part, lost. What do we know? Not enough. And yet, just enough to obsess us. The early Christian community in Rome began as a diasporic religion rooted in the teachings of Peter and Paul, fueled by itinerant missionaries, and driven by slaves, freedmen, and immigrants. It had no properties, no legal personality, nor temples of its own. Roman law prohibited unauthorized religious gatherings. So the Christians adapted. They met in houses, usually those of the wealthiest converts who had space to accommodate them. These houses usually had a large dining room, a courtyard, a back room, or an upper floor that could accommodate groups of 20, 30, and sometimes more people. In these spaces, the first liturgies were celebrated, the scriptures were read, baptisms were performed, bread was broken, and in these same rooms, Roman soldiers occasionally broke in, took people away, crucified the hosts, and burned the walls. That is why so few physical examples are preserved. But some fragments do remain. Let's start with one of the best known, the Titulus Clementis, now the Basilica of San Clemente, near the Colosseum. Under this 12th century church is a 4th century basilica. Below that basilica is a 1st century Roman house. And that house shows signs of Christian use. Frescoes, inscriptions, a room oriented around a central space similar to an altar. Some scholars believe that it was a domus ecclesiae, perhaps even the house of Clemente himself, the first pope and martyr. If true, it is one of the closest things we have to a physical address of the early church in Rome. Then there is the Titulus Pudentis, now the Church of Santa Pudenziana. Tradition says that this was the house of Pudens, a Roman senator converted by Peter himself. However, beneath the current structure, rebuilt many times, are ancient walls that may date from the 2nd century, including mosaic fragments and a baptismal font. Again, suggestive, but not conclusive. Other titula, called domestic churches, the historical map of Christian Rome. Titulus Lucine, Titulus Byzantus, Titulus Prisci, each associated with a real person, each linked to a place where Christians met under threat of death. Many of them ended up as basilicas after Christianity was legalized. But what were these first domestic churches really like? They were not built expressly for that purpose, but adapted. A domus ecclesiae in Roma could be a single-story townhouse or a multi-level insula apartment with a modified atrium. In the larger houses, the triclinium or dining room was sometimes enlarged to accommodate Eucharistic gatherings. Bedrooms were cleared for catechumens. Courtyards were used for baptisms, and roofs for nighttime gatherings. Some houses may have had hidden rooms with false walls, soundproofed and with secret passages, not necessarily designed that way, but thanks to creative use of Roman architectural eccentricities. And this is where it gets complicated. The most successful domestic churches were the least visible. They were not marked with symbols on the outside. They did not fly flags. They did not announce their meetings. Their survival depended on not being distinguished from the houses around them. So how do we find them now? Often we don't. Rome has been rebuilt so many times that most of the domus ecclesiae have been erased by history, overwritten by centuries of demolition and construction. Even the known ones are archaeological fragments rather than monuments. And yet, we have records. The letters of the early church fathers mention domestic churches by name, often in greetings at the end of the epistles. Greet the church in their house, Paul writes in Romans 16. In other texts, we read of bishops installed in private homes, of deacons who welcome communities, of liturgical functions that take place on tables that also serve for nightly meals. And little by little, a pattern emerges. The domus ecclesiae was not just a place. It was a method, a form of worship that adapted to pressure and turned homes into sanctuaries, blurring the line between family and faith. Over time, these houses became too small, too fragile, and too vulnerable. In the early 3rd century, as the number of Christians increased and persecution waxed and waned, some communities began building larger meeting spaces, still unofficial, still private, but more clearly dedicated to worship. These were transitional structures, halfway between the house and the church. But it is on the Vatican Hill itself that the mystery intensifies. Was there a domus ecclesiae near Peter's tomb? It is possible. Some believe that the first Christians marked the site of Peter's burial with a modest structure, perhaps even a converted house that was used for commemorative liturgies and prayer. The so-called Tropaeum of Gaius may have been part of this initiative or adjacent to it, but no such house has been found. However, Under the Vatican necropolis are tombs that show signs of Christian modifications, niches converted into chapels, walls with Christian graffiti superimposed on older inscriptions. One of the chambers contains the inscription, "Peter is here." Was it a burial, a marker, or a room used for worship? We cannot say because the Vatican, unlike other parts of Rome, is more guarded. Excavations are limited, and access is controlled. Many areas remain unexplored, not for lack of interest, but for fear of what may be altered. Therefore, the first Domus Ecclesiae remain mostly theoretical. But their impact is not. They laid the foundations, not of stone, but of practice. The domestic church became the parish. The table became the altar. The host became the priest. And the domestic became divine. It is a story that does not appear in monuments, but exists in the form of faith itself. But those first Christians did more than meet. They left a mark. They baptized. And somewhere in Rome, perhaps under a garden, perhaps behind a wall, the first baptistries still sleep. Let's go into the water. Let's look for hidden places where the first Romans were washed in the name of Christ. The secrets of the first Christian baptistries. In the beginning was water, not the doctrine, nor the dogma, nor the clouds of incense or the creeds, nor the Latin liturgy or the papal bulls. Only water. Cold, clean, consecrated by secrecy and suffering. Baptism was the gateway, the line between church and world. It marked the moment when a Roman citizen, a slave, a soldier, or the wife of a senator crossed to a new identity, one that for centuries could cost you your life. That is why it was done in secret, not in large fountains or golden chapels, but in basements, catacombs, gardens, borrowed courtyards by candlelight and with whispered prayers. And almost none of those original baptismal places have survived. But they were more important than anything because they were the beginning. Finding them today, following the trail of the first Christian baptistries in Rome, especially near or on the Vatican Hill, is like chasing shadows through fog. Let's start where water and faith met. In the early church, baptism was not casual. It was not a ritual added to childhood, nor a quick sprinkling on a baby's head. It was a total immersion of the body. It required months of preparation, sometimes years. The catechumens received instruction on the teachings of Christ, their sincerity was tested, and they were supervised by godparents. And when the time came, they were taken, usually at night, to the water, often naked and always scared. Because baptism was not only symbolic, it was death and resurrection. In the writings of Tertullian, Justin Martyr, Hippolytus, and the Didascalia Apostolum, we see glimpses of this ritual. Prayers of exorcism, triple immersion in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, followed by anointing with oil, white clothing, and the first Eucharist. But where did they go? The first Christians did not have baptismal fonts. They had what they could get. Natural springs, rivers, lakes, and public baths were used whenever discretion allowed. But in Rome, discretion was scarce, so Christians adapted. They used private homes. Some Domus Ecclesiae were reformed to include a pool of water. Some Christian tombs contain signs of ritual washings. In exceptional cases, the cisterns and water channels of the catacombs appear to have been modified, perhaps not only to wash the dead, but also to initiate the living. And this is where the mystery gets complicated, because although catacombs, such as those of Priscilla and Quirinus, contain inscriptions celebrating baptism, we do not have any confirmed baptismal structure from the 2nd century. Archaeology is too fragmentary. The tests are too subtle. But in the 3rd century, something begins to take shape. As the church became more organized, some communities built small, dedicated baptistries, often chambers attached to domestic churches or community spaces. They were often octagonal or circular, symbolizing the new creation. The 8th day, the day beyond Sabbath. One of the oldest known is the Lateran baptistry. Although it has been expanded and rebuilt on numerous occasions, it probably began as a simpler structure in the 4th century, built by Constantine as part of his donation of the Lateran Palace to the church. The current baptistry, which is still preserved, houses a large octagonal pool large enough to allow total immersion. He became a model, but he was not first. Older fragments point to more basic sites. Let's take, for example, the baptistry located under the Church of San Giovanni in Font, in Naples, possibly from the 3rd century, with ancient mosaics on the floor and inscriptions, or the fragmentary remains of what may have been a baptismal hall under Santa Maria Antiqua in the Roman Forum. But on the Vatican Hill, that's where the trail ends. Which is strange, because if Peter was buried there, if the pilgrims came to pray there, if Constantine built his first basilica there, wouldn't there be a place for baptism? Some believe that there was, and that it was hidden. Remember that the Vatican Hill was a necropolis, a place for the dead. Roman law forbade the living to live there, much less perform rituals. But that legal restriction made it ideal for persecuted, watched, and hunted Christians to exercise their most intimate rites. And so they did, possibly in open tombs, possibly in converted mausoleums, possibly in underground cisterns converted into baptismal fonts. During the 1940s, in the excavations of the Vatican necropolis, archaeologists discovered water channels and piles in unusual positions, some adjacent to tombs with Christian graffiti. Although officially classified as drains or ritual purification for the dead, some scholars speculate that they could have served as primitive baptistries. Could this be where the first Roman converts were baptized? Could it be that the same water that anointed the bones of the martyrs washed away the sins of the senators? It is not impossible. And then there is the theory of a hidden baptistry. Some Vatican researchers believe that the original basilica of St. Peter of Constantine could have included a small baptismal chapel lost under the layers of the Renaissance construction. No records of such a structure are preserved, but some 16th century plans mention a regeneration chamber adjacent to the confession area above the supposed tomb of Peter. Perhaps it is a myth, or perhaps it is the truth buried like everything else. Because baptism in the early church should never have been seen. It was for the initiated, for those who'd passed the test. Even the architecture shows this. The first baptistries were separated from the main church. You could not enter the basilica until after being baptized. Until then, you had not been born. Thus, the baptismal font became a uterus, the octagon a symbol of rebirth, the water a tomb, and the silence of those first baptisms a vow. Because saying, "I am a Christian," meant putting yourself in danger. And yet, they came. The slaves, the widows, the soldiers, the sons of the senators, one after another, night after night, plunged into the water and entered history. But for the bishops who baptized them, there was still no marble throne, no golden tomb, no basilica in which to die. Were they buried before the popes were buried under St. Peter? Where did the first bishops of Rome rest? Let us follow the trail of forgotten tombs, humble graves, the first papal burials lost in the dark of history. The funerary practices of the first popes. Before they were locked in bronze, before their names were engraved in the marble of the Vatican, before their deaths became holidays and their tombs altars, the first popes were buried as fugitives, as outlaws, as men trying not to be remembered too strongly. They were not pontiffs in the modern sense. They were bishops of an illegal church, leaders of a persecuted movement. And their tombs, like their lives, were designed to disappear. This is the quietest chapter in the history of the Vatican, the burial of the first popes. And almost everything is lost. But what little we can trace takes us to the depths of the underworld of Rome. Let's start with a stark fact. Most of the first popes were martyrs. From Peter in the 1st century to Sixtus II in the 3rd, the title of Bishop of Rome was usually accompanied by a death sentence. Under emperors such as Nero, Domitian, Decius, and Valerian, church leaders were regularly arrested, tortured, and executed, sometimes beheaded, sometimes crucified, sometimes starved to death in Roman prisons. The job description included a tomb. So, where are they buried? There is no official papal cemetery, no basilica, no papal crypt carved in white stone. Instead, the first bishops of Rome were buried in catacombs. They were not death cathedrals. They were networks for survival. The catacombs, underground cemeteries excavated from the soft, tough rock outside the city walls, were used by both Jews and Christians. Kilometers of tunnels, some barely wide enough to pass, housed hundreds of thousands of tombs. The bodies were wrapped in linen, placed in niches called loy, and sealed with slabs of marble or terracotta. For the first popes, this was their final resting place. Let's follow the path. The catacomb of San Clemente on the Via of Ion is among the most important burial places of early Christianity. Founded in the 2nd century, it became the official cemetery of the bishops of Roma. In the depths of its galleries lies the crypt of the popes. This small chamber excavated directly into rock once housed the remains of 9 early popes, from Anicino to Utatiano, along with other Christian martyrs. Inscriptions engraved on its walls identify their names: Pontiano, Fabiano, Sixto II, and others. Some tombstones bear the word martyr, but not all are marked, and not all are still there. In the 9th century, when Roma faced invasions and instability, many relics and remains were exhumed and moved. Some to the Laterano, others to churches within the city walls, and others were lost during the transfer, which means that we no longer know where the remains of several of the first popes are. Then there is Pedro. His case stands alone. Tradition says that he was crucified upside down in the circus of Narration around the year 64 D.C., buried in a nearby tomb and secretly venerated. In the 2nd century, a small monument, the Tropion of Gavus, was erected on the site, and in the 4th century, Constantino built a basilica over it. Modern excavations beneath the Basilica of San Pedro discovered a necropolis and possibly the actual remains of Pedro. A niche with bones and graffiti that says, "Pedro is here." It is one of the few apostolic burial places that has both a tradition and a possible archaeological match. But the rest, most of the first popes, were not buried under cathedrals. They were buried in dark tunnels. Some in the catacomb of Priscilla, others in the catacomb of Domitilla, others in lesser-known cemeteries that are now lost or sealed. In these labyrinths, the inscriptions offer clues. Graffiti in Latin scratched onto the plaster. Symbols: doves, palm branches, anchors, fish. Occasional names like Existus Episcopus, Cornelius Martyr, Lucius and Christo, which bear witness to truncated lives, remembered only in fragments. And yet, those fragments tell a story. The first popes were not monarchs. They were shepherds who walked with their flock towards death. They did not sit upon golden thrones. They shared tomb walls with deacons, widows, and children. Their papacy was not a privilege. It was a sentence, and that is why their burials were usually improvised. During periods of intense persecution, there was no time for ceremonies. The bishop was arrested, executed, and discarded. The followers recovered the body if they could and secretly took it to the nearest catacomb, often at night, risking arrest. The tomb was shallow, the inscription brief. Sometimes it was nothing more than a scratched scrawl and the name of Christo. And what is worse, many of those tombs are lost. The catacombs, which were once enormous, have collapsed in some places, have been flooded, have been built on top of, were looted in the Middle Ages, rediscovered in the 16th and 19th centuries, but have never been fully excavated. It is estimated that more than half of the early Christian funerary tunnels of Roma remain inaccessible. And somewhere in that half are the first pope after Pedro, and the one who followed him, and the one who wrote to Corinto, and the one who stood firm during the purge of Valeriano. Popes who shaped the church, popes who left no tombstone. What did the Vaticano do then? He created memory. In the 4th century, after Constantine's conversion, the church began to build new basilicas over old cemeteries. These were acts of both reverence and recovery. The places of martyrdom became churches. The catacombs became pilgrimage routes. The relics were exhumed, consecrated, and assigned festive days. But it was also a rearrangement of history. The bones of some bishops were moved not necessarily to honor them, but to situate the lineage of the church and connect the altars with blood, so that the papacy was not only a position, but a relic in the Basilica of San Juan de Latran, Cathedral of the Bishop of Roma. The relics of the first popes were gathered, displayed, and celebrated in the Lateran baptistry, the place where the Roman bishops baptized converts for centuries, which became a reliquary. But the origins were darker, more intimate, more dangerous. And somewhere in the lightless corners of those catacombs, their tombs may still be open, unmarked, unclaimed, because long before the bronze statue of Pedro received kisses on its feet, his successors were buried in silence. And as we pursue the dead, we must also remember the monuments they left behind, not in words, nor in relics, but in even stranger, even heavier objects like the obelisk that now crosses St. Peter's Square. A relic not of saints, but of pharaohs. Let's follow the journey and the mystery of Caligula's obelisk. The disappearance of the Emperor Caligula's obelisk. It rises above St. Peter's Square like a spear stuck in time. A 25-meter high red granite column, without inscriptions, intact, immutable over the centuries. Tourists photograph it without blinking. Pilgrims pass it by on their way to Mass. The Swiss guards remain nearby, motionless, ceremonious. Now it seems so normal, so obvious, so part of the skin of the Vaticano. But this monument is older than Christianity, older than Pedro, older than Rome itself. It is the last vestige that remains of a disappeared structure, a structure that was once soaked in blood, a structure linked to a mad emperor and the destruction of an entire belief system. This is the obelisk of Caligula, and for a time, enough to forget that it disappeared. Let's start in Egypto. The obelisk was carved in Heliopolis, the ancient city of the sun, during the reign of an unknown pharaoh, probably around the 13th or 12th century BC. It was not erected as decoration, but as a cosmological sign, a ray of sun in stone, a needle that connected the earth and the sky. A monument without inscriptions, although in this case, curiously, not with divine authority. Most Egyptian obelisks bear hieroglyphs, names of gods, feats of kings, spells to keep the stone alive. But not this one. This obelisk is blank. Why? We do not know. It is one of the only obelisks that are preserved from Egypto without any inscription. It may have been unfinished or its text intentionally erased before its transport, since in the 1st century AD. This stone was torn from its sacred ground and sent to Roma. The man who ordered this was Julio Caesar Augusto Germanico, the 3rd emperor of Roma. You know him better as Caligula. The reign of Caligula, between 37 and 41 AD, was a brief and surreal outburst of power and paranoia. Famous for his excesses, his cruelty, and his theater of madness, he did not see himself as a simple emperor, but as a living god. And he wanted a circus, not a venue for shows, but a declaration of intent. He chose the Vaticano Hill. Why? It was on Roma's outskirts, beyond the Primarium, and thus free of certain religious restrictions. But more than that, it was a space, land without baggage, where he could leave his mark. So Caligula built a circus for chariot races, executions, and the exhibition of imperial power. Known later as the Circus of Nero, it may have been started by Caligula and completed by his successors. It was oval and long, surrounded by seats and statues. And in its center, on the spina, the central strip of the track, the obelisk stood. The obelisk of Caligula was transported from Egypt to Roma in a huge ship that took it upriver and was erected with ceremony. A pagan talisman transplanted from one empire into another. It remained there silently for centuries. He saw gladiators die. He saw Christians burn. He saw Pedro, perhaps crucified in its shadow. But then Roma changed. Christianity took hold. The temples fell. The basilicas rose. And the circus fell into ruin. In the 4th century, Constantino built the first basilica of San Pedro in the vicinity, deliberately placing the altar on the supposed tomb of Pedro and not in the center of the old circus. The obelisk was still standing, but now as an uncomfortable relic, a pagan tooth protruding from Christian gums. Time passed. The circus collapsed. Its marble was looted. The area was reused. And at some point, the obelisk faded from memory. Not physically, it was still standing, but people forgot what it was, where it came from, who had erected it, what it meant. In the Middle Ages, it was just a curiosity, a stone column in a field. The locals called it the Witness, perhaps in reference to its silent testimony to the martyrdom of the saints, or perhaps just a myth superimposed on another. Pope Sixtus V, at the end of the 16th century, decided to recover it. He wanted to Christianize Roma, not only spiritually, but visually. He ordered that the ancient Egyptian obelisks be removed from the ruins, re-erected in squares, and crowned with crosses. And the obelisk of the Vatican was the jewel in the crown. In 1586, under the direction of the architect Domenico Fontana, it was moved with great difficulty from its location in the circus ruins to the center of the new plaza of San Pedro, where it remains today. The transfer was dangerous. The obelisk weighed over 320 tons. It took 900 men, 140 horses, and 75 pulleys to move it. Fontana's meticulous diagrams are still preserved. The operation lasted weeks. Legend has it that, during the raising, the Pope ordered absolute silence under penalty of death until a sailor shouted, "Water on the ropes," to prevent them from breaking, thus saving the monument. Sixtus rewarded him instead of executing him. The obelisk was placed upright, crowned with a bronze cross. Inside that cross, Sixtus had a fragment of the true cross sealed by means of an architectural exorcism. From the sun god to Christ, from the pharaoh to the pope, from chariot races to papal processions. But the stone itself remains blank, remains silent, and continues to carry the weight of memory. Because this is what the Vatican does not disclose. It is likely that the obelisk's base rests on the exact spina of the old circus. The line where the carts turned, where Christians were tied to stakes, where Pedro may have looked up for the last time and seen that needle shadow before his world turned upside down. And below, fragments, foundations, unexcavated ruins of the circus. Perhaps altars, perhaps tombs, or perhaps something stranger. Because if the obelisk of Caligula was the circus's anchor, what else did he plant there? Other Egyptian artifacts? Other imperial monuments? Or something darker? The ship that brought the obelisk to Rome was so enormous that it was later sunk and used as the foundation for a port. And what did it bring back? Gold statues or parchments? Some say the Vatican keeps relics of that cargo. Others whisper that there are storage chambers under the bay of the obelisk, sealed since the 16th century. And the obelisk itself, still without inscription, still without answer, remains standing, watching how the centuries pass beneath it. But if the obelisk is the oldest monument preserved in the Vatican City, it also marks the axis where ancient Rome ends and the new begins. And somewhere around that axis, letters were sent, words of power, messages from the Bishop of Rome to the dispersed churches of the empire. But what happened to the first of those letters? Let's look for the first papal edicts and how they were written, delivered, and almost forgotten. The first papal letters or edicts. Before encyclicals crossed oceans and sealed envelopes. Before papal decrees resonated in parchments and doctrines. Before bulls were issued with lead seals bearing the keys of Peter and the names of the pontiffs. There were simpler missives, folded pieces of papyrus, lines scribbled in Greek or rudimentary Latin, carried by hand, smuggled through checkpoints, read in the light of lamps, and whispered in congregations. These were the first papal letters, and almost all have disappeared, not because they never existed, but because they existed in a world not designed to remember them. A world of fear, persecution, and improvisation, in which the church only wrote what it had to write and did not keep anything it could risk losing. However, some fragments have barely survived, and in them is the portrait of a papacy that had not yet been enthroned, but that already spoke with authority. Authority in exile. Authority under arrest. Let's start at the start. Clement of Rome. Clement is traditionally considered the fourth bishop of Rome after Peter, Linus, and Cletus. His authorship of the first epistle to the Corinthians, written around the year 96 A.D.C., constitutes one of the first preserved examples of a Christian leader in Rome writing to another church, and possibly the first recorded case of Roman ecclesiastical authority extending beyond its walls. The letter was written in Greek. It addresses a schism in the Church of Corinth and urges unity, humility, and obedience to the elders. But more than that, It affirms Roman supervision, not by force but by implication. Clement never says, "I order you," but the tone is unequivocal. Rome is watching. Rome is shepherding. This is a proto-papal behavior that lays the foundation for what will come next. But the line between letter and edict is very fine. Were these letters private correspondence or official decrees? In Clement's time, the distinction hardly existed. The church was too small, too persecuted, and too disorganized to worry about categories. The letters were everything: theological clarification, pastoral care, political decision, and spiritual encouragement, all in one. And Clement's letter not only survived in Rome, but also in Alexandria, Syria, and finally in the Codex Alexandrinus, a 5th century manuscript of the Bible, where the letter was copied next to the scriptures, suggesting that it was considered almost canonical. But where is the original? Disappeared. There is no papyrus, no parchment, no autographed manuscript, only later copies. And Clement was not alone. In the 2nd century, we have evidence that Bishop Soter wrote to Corinth this letter described by Dionysius of Corinth as full of moral exhortation and encouragement. Then there is Bishop Victor at the end of the 2nd century, who took a hard line against the controversial question of when to celebrate Easter. Victor's edict was not just a local letter. It was a political statement. He declared that the churches of Asia Minor, which celebrated Easter on a different date, were out of communion with Rome. This was not well received. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, responded by urging tolerance. But Victor's letter was quite a declaration. Rome claimed authority not only in the geographic scope, but also in the temporal. We still do not have the letter, only references and quotes in later writings and fragments preserved in the PMIC. The 3rd century brought a sharp increase in papal production, endangered by the persecutions of Decian and Valerian, which explicitly targeted the clergy. The bishops were imprisoned or executed. Churches were closed. The letters became a lifeline between the bishops, between Rome and the provinces, between the faithful and the deceased faithful. Pope Cornelius, for example, wrote to Cyprian of Carthage around the year 251 AC, describing the size and structure of the Roman Church. 46 priests, 7 deacons, 42 acolytes, and more than 500 widows and people in need supported by the community. It is not just a census. It is a show of force. It is Rome saying, "We are organized. We are surviving. We are the heart of this faith." Cornelius' letters were preserved by Cyprian, who quoted them extensively. Cyprian himself was a prolific writer, and his correspondence with the Roman popes is one of the few intact windows into the ecclesiastical diplomacy of the 3rd century. And then there is Pope Stephen I, who ruled during a time of controversy over baptism. Should converts baptized by heretical groups be rebaptized? Stephen said no. Cyprian said yes. A war of letters broke out. None of Stephen's originals are preserved, but his position is quoted, paraphrased, and hotly debated in Cyprian's preserved works. Once again, the papacy spoke out. His words were remembered, although the parchment was not. So what happened to these ancient documents? Why are so few originals left? 3 reasons. Fragility of the material. The letters were written on papyrus or primitive parchment, vulnerable to rot, fire, water, and decomposition. Political risk. During the persecutions, documents were burned or hidden. The Edict of Decius of the year 250 A.C. specifically required the delivery of Christian scriptures and correspondence. Many churches destroyed their archives to protect their people. Historical retrospective. Later generations of ecclesiastical officials did not always value the earliest letters. If they did not conform to current doctrine or were not considered theologically essential, they were allowed to disappear. But here's the twist. Some may still exist. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly the Secret Archive, contains kilometers and kilometers of shelves, many of them still partially cataloged. Some contain ancient fragments of ecclesiastical correspondence. From time to time, a letter from a forgotten bishop appears. From time to time, a new reference points to a lost missive. And buried there, perhaps, just perhaps, are the first papal edicts those that we have never read in Greek, in Latin, and written with trembling hands, transported across the empire. Read aloud in candlelit rooms, and then folded, sealed, and buried in tombs when their authors passed away. Because for the first bishops of Rome, words were a risk, but also power, and they knew it. And when they wrote, whether to Corinth or Carthage, Alexandria or Antioch, they did more than manage disputes. They were building something, not only a church, not only a papacy, but a presence. And long before Peter's successors wore silk and gold, they walked in sandals, and they wrote. And their words survived not because they were engraved in stone, but because they were transmitted by memory, by martyrdom, by love. But those memories, like those letters, were fragile. And nowhere is that fragility more evident than in the dark years before Constantine, the time when even the Pope's own history was diffuse, vague, incomplete. Because before the bishops of Rome became the popes of Christendom, they were legends. And their secret history remains the last true mystery of pre-Constantinian Rome. Let's open the book. The secret history of the Roman pontiffs before Constantine. Before the papal tiara, before the Swiss guard, before the Vatican was a sovereign city-state with its own passport and postage stamps, there is a list of names, a fragile chain that stretched from Peter to Sylvester, that united the apostles with the emperors, with about 40 links, most short, some bloody, all mysterious. This is the list of the first popes, and it is full of ghosts. The Liber Pontificalis, the Book of the Popes, is our oldest and most complete record of papal succession. It begins with Peter and ends, at least in its initial form, around the 6th century, and offers biographies, some long and some ridiculously brief, of all the bishops of Rome. But the more you delve into its early chapters, the less history you read, and the more myth, not invented, not fiction, but geography and history steeped in legend. The first pontiffs, those who ruled before Constantine, lived lives so intertwined with persecution, poverty, and secrecy that even the church had difficulty keeping track of them. Let's go through this fog. After Peter, tradition gives us Linus. Mentioned by name in 2 Timothy 4 verse 21, Linus is believed to have led the Roman Church after Peter's death, possibly from the late 60s to around 76 AC. But, apart from his name, there is almost nothing. No letters, no writings, no inscriptions. Only a note in the Liber Pontificus stating that he approved decrees on the veil of women in the Church, almost certainly invented centuries later. Then comes Anacletus, or is it Cletus, or are they the same person? The first lists are divided. Some include both names, others confuse them. He is said to have organized the early clergy and divided the city into parishes. A strange idea for a persecuted sect living underground. Once again, there are no documents or tombs that can be conclusively linked to him. Clement I, we have already spoken of the author of the letter to Corinth, one of the few whose voice still resonates through the fog. But even here legends accumulate, that he was exiled, martyred, thrown into the sea with an anchor around his neck, that his bones were miraculously recovered centuries later, that he may have been consecrated by Peter himself. The pattern continues. Evaristus, Alexander, Sixtus I, Telesphorus, all names, all buried under layers of devotional assumptions. Some are said to have celebrated Mass in secret, others supposedly establish holidays. One is credited with the institution of the Gloria in Excelsis Deo, but these are rituals projected retrospectively, taken from the later liturgy and adapted to the early bishops. And yet the list persists even when it contradicts itself, even when it duplicates names, even when it tries to explain how a man could rule the Roman Church for 10 years while Christianity was still technically a capital crime. Why? Because the list was never just about memory. It was about legitimacy, succession, continuity. Rome needed to prove that it had always been the center, that it had never separated from the apostolic line, that Peter handed his keys to Leo, who handed them to Anacletus, who passed them on to Clement as in a divine relay race. And to some extent, this was true. There was a true sequence of bishops in Rome. But the record of their lives is where gaps appear, and the Vatican knows this perfectly well. It is widely accepted by scholars that the first Liber Pontificalis retroactively filled in many details. Holidays were assigned, martyrdoms presumed, edicts were invented, even burial places were conjectured, and, over time, these conjectures solidified into stone. Churches were named after them. Altars were built, relics were claimed. But in many cases, we do not know where these men were buried. We do not know what they taught. We do not know how they were elected. We do not know how they lived, died, or ruled. Let's take Pope Cornelius as an example, who ruled between 251 and 253. We have his letters. We know that he faced Novitio, who proclaimed himself rival pope, the first antipope in history. But even the exact place where Cornelius was buried was the subject of debate for centuries. Or Pope Fabian, martyred in 250 under Duzius. Legend says that a dove descended on him when he was elected as a sign of divine approval. But this image only appears much later in art, not in contemporary sources. Or Pope Calixtus, a slave who ascended to bishop, excommunicated by Hippolytus for being too lenient with sinners. He is associated with the catacomb that bears his name. But was he really buried there? Or was that name given to him posthumously to consolidate his legacy? The more we delve, the more confusing everything becomes. And that is no coincidence. The early popes did not leave memoirs. They left communities. They left prayers. Sometimes they left bones. And most importantly, they left the faith. A faith that was continued by their successors, who had to reconstruct their stories from fragments of tradition, oral memory, and fragments of stone. And sometimes those fragments lie under the Vatican, misidentified, mislabeled, or simply sealed. There are persistent rumors, never confirmed, of ancient papal sarcophagi stored in the Vatican grotto, of inscriptions found and then removed, of a secret shelf in the Apostolic Archive containing a 2nd century parchment, too fragile to unroll and too dangerous to discard. These are not conspiracy theories. They are possibilities because the Church is old and old institutions do not throw things away. They archive them. They protect them. They keep them as treasure. Because what would it mean to find a letter from Anacletus, a diary from Clement, or a first-hand account of the last days of Peter? It would rewrite the history of the origins of the Church. And that story, with all its power, with all its resistance, is still unfinished, incomplete, like a mosaic with missing pieces. A legacy shaped as much by what is missing as by what survives. And that is the power of the first popes. It is not that they ruled visibly, but that they led invisibly. It is not that they built monuments, but that they built memory. A memory now locked in gold and marble. But still, somewhere below it waits. It whispers, and it challenges us to remember what the Vatican was. A place of the persecuted, a refuge for the poor, a cemetery, a cradle, an enigma. And we have barely begun to solve it.